Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today by the fine gentleman, Rupert August, who will be walking us through his research and his findings and his thoughts as regards this idea of an international right, um, basically running from the period immediately following the end of the Second World War, um, up into the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. Before we get to that, I want to thank all of my channel supporters. I have been gone for quite some time from YouTube. The exigencies of marriage and a child on the way. So I apologize to everyone, but thanks very much for those who support the channel and have stuck by me for quite some time. I have links in the show notes, the description below for books that you can buy, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so there. All of the credit, none of the blame, and yeah, buy my books. So with that sort of introductory stuff out of the way, we have Rupert August here. He got in touch with me because he's been doing some research into this idea of an international right. And my understanding is that he's seen a number of interesting threads that connect things. Now, this is a subject I should warn everyone I don't know much about. So hopefully I will be able to keep up with him. He's a careful reader and scholar. Those of you who have been following the channel will have seen that he's been a guest in the past on the channel. We've talked about intelligence services, espionage, these sorts of things. But this subject for me, in terms of just a general context, is very, very interesting because we see some degree of coordination in nationalist movements. Now, that is not to say, I mean, today, that is not to say that we are necessarily dealing, or that I think we're necessarily dealing with some sort of highly centralized and controlled arrangement, where you have one major player upstream. Though, again, I'm not particularly knowledgeable about this subject, so I'm not discounting that possibility. But you look at things like Prometheism. I've done a number of streams on that with guests like Charlemagne, Martin Zellner, and others. And in the course of doing that, it became very, very clear that, what we think of globalism as typically using the left, or globalist forces, if you will, or the gay, as some people like to call it. We typically think of them as sort of, articulating their pressures and their manipulative force through the left. But it seems quite clear that at least certain factions who support a globalist future for all of us are perfectly willing and able to use the right as well, with where we see the fostering and support for Ukrainian nationalism, Polish nationalism, the nationalism in the Baltic. So, the wider idea of how there might be coordination in such efforts, and any sort of background for the history of this is very, very interesting for me. Again, I don't know where this is going, and I do not claim to be particularly knowledgeable about this subject in general. There are a number of esoteric, for me, groups that appear as characters in it that people like Thomas 777 or Pete Quinones probably know quite a bit about. Divisions between Yaki and Spengler following the end of World War II, as regards any idea of a pan-European nationalism, whether or not, the Europe should focus on going with the United States as a sort of center of gravity for it and a partner in the initial stages versus the Soviet Union. So all of this is very, very interesting to me against this background. There's also, a certain degree of coordination, which I think is visible in the development of right-wing movements in Europe today, or at least arguably so. When you see it, and also put right wing in quotes. in terms of what I'm talking about here, because I'm certainly not saying that Elon Musk or Reform or AFD or Geert Wilders or any of these other, or Maloney, or um, groups, Rassemblement National in France. I'm not saying that they are all necessarily right wing, but they are characterized as such. They take an oppositional position, at least superficially, against the current powers in Europe, in European countries. And there does seem to be, at least arguably, some degree of coordination between them. So again, a bit of context, both the context further back and the context for this in the present. But again, I don't know much about it. Rupert August has been learning quite a bit about it himself of late. So I'm going to turn it over to him. I believe the beginning of the story is somewhere in there after the end of the Second World War. But before he carries us into this topic, I do want to invite everyone here to look. There are links below for his YouTube channel with a fair amount of content on it, and for his stuff over on X. We're both active there. For those of you who only follow me on YouTube, I stay pretty busy spouting nonsense on X. So if you're jonesing for said nonsense, you can get plenty of it over there. But I do hope to produce more content for YouTube in future. So I'll turn it over to Rupert August. If there's anything at the outset you want to say by way of introduction, sir, please do so. Thank you so much for coming on. I very much look forward to this.
Yeah, thank you for having me on again. The only additional introduction I would add is definitely go and check out those previous streams that we've done together, because I am immensely proud of those, and it's part of the reason I wanted to come back with a topic that was worthy and in the same kind of vein. You talked about the centralized versus decentralized sort of angle, and that's a good one to bear in mind. I feel like this one, more so than the previous two streams, there's going to be a little bit more conjecture about some of the angles of certain things, especially in terms of senior parties, because sometimes it's not necessarily easy to tell who's actually in the driving seat, even if you could do like a systems analysis and determine logically that one party should be in charge. I'll try and point out those instances when they come along, but it's a bit of a murky topic. But by the nature of the way that I've done the research into all of this, it sort of naturally comes out as a little bit more of a coordinated top-down sort of thing. So just kind of bear that in mind, I guess, as we're going through, because there will be elements where it's valid to kind of sit back and think if there's another explanation to some things, or ways in which leverage could have been the other way around in various ways. But without too much more preamble, I think it makes most sense to start with the Galen organization. So the Galen organization starts off as a group of officers that are within the German military, the World War II German military intelligence. And they are much more affiliated, supposedly, with the Imperial, the General Staff side of things. So you may know things like Operation Valkyrie and the general sort of trajectory of, indeed the Oster affair, I think it is called, the involving Wilhelm Canaris and his attempts to essentially stop World War II in its tracks in 1938, unsuccessfully, obviously. So you have these two schools. You have those, and then you have the National Socialists on the other side. And at least according to his memoirs, Galen places himself very firmly on the general staff side of the equation, the old traditional Prussian aristocracy. But despite claiming to have known ahead of time about Operation Valkyrie and the attempt to assassinate Hitler, and there apparently being documentation that links him to it, he conveniently it all gets destroyed, either in the closing days of the war, or because his assistant was able to destroy it all before all that evidence, before before anyone found it when the investigations were taking place. Now, that's quite relevant because it seems like quite a lot of his career ends up being essentially the method by which certain ex-National Socialists, especially SS members, are spirited out of Germany on so-called rat lines, or via, I think it's called Die Spinne. But that's more closely associated with Otto Skorzeny. But Skorzeny is one of the main beneficiaries of this process, and he was definitely in some kind of contact, and I would say at the very least tacit collaboration with Galen and the Galen organization. But anyway, prior to all that, his first arrival on the scene is basically he concludes that there must be a competent intelligence service that is going to transition into the new Germany, whatever it is, or to, basically to take the fight. So in particular, Galen is tasked with military intelligence on the Eastern Front. And so he's obviously carrying all of that Soviet, like all of his Soviet related networks and all the Soviet intel that he's been able to accrue so far. He wants to carry that over to the Allies in some capacity. First, he goes to the British, and there's conflicting reports on this, but the British seem to not be too interested in him, and instead kind of push him towards the Americans instead. That's kind of curious in itself for reasons that we'll maybe get to later, but it kind of seems like one of his contentions, one of his sort of main contentions early on, is that the Americans are insufficiently wary of the Soviet threat, basically. So his first job, as he perceives it, is to basically try to get the Americans to appreciate that the Soviets are going to be the next enemy. And so once he's done that, and well, according to him, this process doesn't actually complete amongst the American public until the Korean War, actually. So essentially,
so we're talking about the years immediately following the end of the war, when, in large part, as I understand it, a significant part of the German intelligence services are sort of carried over whole and placed under the Americans.
Yes, some of it gets supported by MI6 to some capacity as well. I think I kind of wonder whether there's certain other things going on, because there's some like extremely circumstantial evidence that suggests that Alan Dulles may have also, the founder of the first director, I think it was, possibly one of the early directors, basically one of the more famous early directors of the CIA. So his previous posting was as head of the OSS in Switzerland, and that basically put him in contact, put him basically on the forefront of the spy game with regards to the National Socialists. And he seems to have worked with sort of so the way that it eventually comes to work is that the Galen organization works for the Americans pay them directly, and then the Galen organization kind of farms out some of that work to certain other agents that they are affiliated with, and quite a lot of those end up being ex-SS, ex-National Socialists, etc. Those types of people who are quite disposable. One of the things that makes them sort of easy to use is not only the fact that they have ideological commitments to fighting the Soviets, but they also are. They basically there's a permanent leverage against them, basically, because there's a sort of Damocles hanging over all of their heads, and so they're very easy to use from that perspective. But basically, all these organizations. So the CIA allegedly never uses ex-SS personnel, and Galen never knowingly uses like committed ideological, especially high-ranking ex-SS people. But that seems to be like a technicality to me, because yeah, like I said, these guys are definitely working in some capacity for Galen, and Galen seems to. He claims he doesn't know. That's the other possible out. But yeah, definitely there's like a certain amount of organization that's going on here for espionage purposes, and later on for the stay behind forces as well. So most notably that would be Gladio, but there was Operation Saturn as well, for Germany, and various other similar groups around Europe. Only some of which we have good documentation on, if only because sometimes they became involved in scandals and it came up through court proceedings and such. So that was the case with Operation Gladio in 1990, I believe. So one of the main conflicts, going back quickly, is in terms of strategy between Galen and his Eastern Intelligence Command. I think this is potentially the position of the General Staff in general, is that they want to basically treat the war against the Soviets as a war of liberation rather than a war of conquest. So they are very in favor of the nationalist formations and accepting defectors into organized military formations to use against the Soviets, to basically have so formations like the Russian Liberation Army is obviously one of the more famous ones, led by Vlasov, but all of the other groups, including the Baltic peoples, some Poles, I think, some like collaborationist Poles even, and in particular the Ukrainians under Bandera, for example. They were all basically a pet project of the General Staff, including Galen in particular. And as I understand it, Galen basically took a lot of these contacts with him and tried to transfer over directly. So you may already be aware of some of these organizations that existed after the Soviets had already sort of rolled over the lines. I don't think that many of the Russians kind of made it through, because I think a lot of those guys were handed over, but some of the minorities were able to either keep fighting in some capacity. So the Forest Brothers are one of the more famous groups, but there's also the Polish Cursed Soldiers movement, which is quite lesser known, as I understand it. Basically a number of Polish either resistance formations or sometimes returned, or like ex-army personnel and people like that who wanted to resist the Soviet encroachment. And if you can tell by the name, they do not do very well out of the whole arrangement. The Forest Brothers do a little bit better, but ultimately they are still crushed.
And so what I see here is basically a continuation of this idea of Prometheism, which is, Piłsudski's ostensibly idea, probably going back further and probably shared by others who supported Piłsudski in Poland, which is where you take, for those who don't know about this, I'm sure you do, you basically take, whether you're talking about the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, or indeed Russia today, you take countries that are within that network and you simply move them from one column to the other to remove those resources and that manpower and that military strength and that economic strength from the Russian column, however construed, whether it's the USSR or the Empire or whatever, into an anti-Russian column. And we see that indeed going on, arguably today with Ukraine, with the attempts in Belarus, with Georgia, with Moldova. So and with NATO expansion to the coast of the Black Sea, is that basically what we're looking at here?
Yeah, to a great extent. I think even I've not read explicitly about this, but I've kind of heard in conversation that this kind of connection between West Germany, because the Galen organization eventually goes on to become the actual official West German intelligence service, and de facto obviously takes over as the main German intelligence service. My understanding is that they were actually the primary source of the sort of like flow of, I guess you could call it, propaganda into Ukraine, especially Western Ukraine, about the benefits that they would have from separating from the Soviet Union in general, which, not only have they not materialized, they've been left in a pretty severe hole at this point. But even kind of more than that, the movements that were not necessarily entirely seeded by people like Galen and the Galen organization, but that were sort of kept on life support. And I should say MI6 was involved with some of this stuff as well, I believe. Well, not necessarily MI6 explicitly, but the British intelligence services were also, I believe, involved with people like Bandera. Perhaps even more so, if only because because although I've not been able to find much good information on the exact connections there, noting the fact that most of the Ukrainian let's call them resistance fighters end up in Canada, of all places. To me that says more British affiliation rather than German affiliation, albeit the Bandera himself gets assassinated like right down the road from where the Galen organization is based.
Yeah, that's interesting because we, of course, heard the outrage about the Ukrainian who stood up in the Canadian Parliament, within the last few years, who apparently had a colorful background. But yes, go on.
Just quickly, I'm conscious of the fact that I've sort of gone through quite a few points there. So, is there anything that you think I should expand on before moving on?
Unfortunately, I'm not qualified, with knowledge of the organization to suggest much beyond what I did. It sounds as though that we just tapped Germany as a part of this story, and it goes to the United States. It goes to Britain, very likely, and we see the formation of the the post-war German intelligence services in their seed form. Yes.
Yes, it must be said that takes place a fair bit later. I don't remember the year exactly. I think it was 1963. But up until that point, they are being paid directly and wholly by America.
From my notes, it looks like it becomes West Germany's BND in 1956.
56, okay.
Closely with the CIA to monitor Soviet activities. Yeah, and it apparently was tied, as you were sort of hinting at, to Gladio networks. Yeah.
You might have to correct me on dates because the dates sort of have been blending together for me a bit.
Well, the listeners have been warned.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so yes, we have the Galen organization there. So the relevance of I mentioned Otto Skorzeny briefly because he's an entirely separate node in this, although I believe deeply connected to the Galen organization. So Skorzeny himself gets captured very late in the war, obviously. He somewhat sees the writing on the wall, and he actually is part of an SS scheme to try to collect up as much wealth as possible for use in some kind of future movement of some kind. Obviously, I'm sure people have heard about, I think it's called Operation Werewolf, but the werewolf idea of National Socialist civilians essentially waging a guerrilla war of sorts on the occupation forces. But that really doesn't come to much in the end. Another possible scheme is the Circle of Friends, which was formed by Himmler in I think it might have had a longer life actually, but it kind of came to a relevant head in 1944 because he was kind of staring down the barrel of what he believed to be a lost conventional war and wanted to look ahead to how the Reich could be maintained into the future. The conclusion that he came to was just gathering up all of the various industrial concerns that were by that point associated with the National Socialists, and essentially getting some money off the books stowed away in various places and assets and things so that there could be a support network to basically create a fourth Reich down the line was the rough idea.
And it seems as though it had its official cover, or what would have made it palatable to people after the war, in charge who would have been, a bit cautious about such organizations. It was basically corporate backing for anti-communist causes. From my notes, it looks like it was a pre-World War II group. But again, with this, the idea of industrialists funding the SS and other efforts.
Yes, yeah. So it originates pre-war, but that's what I mean by came to a head, because that's when it takes on this new characteristic that I'm talking about of like trying to prepare for what's going to happen after the war. I've not seen any evidence that did actually succeed. So Dulles claims that that it was basically shut down completely. There's some what I believe to be fairly, again, circumstantial evidence that Britain may have treated it as something worth cooperating with early on. It's a bit of a convoluted story to get there, but I can kind of summarize quickly that essentially Britain seems to have come into contact with Himmler earlier than is officially stated, and interrogated him for a while before officially stated, about a week, I think, and then proceeded to have him assassinated a little bit later. I think the reason for this would be because Britain is, more so than the other powers, was sort of confirmed to have intelligence connections with various other, the National Socialists at the moment is the relevant part, but I think basically everyone. So if I had to give my take as to why they had him killed, why they had Himmler killed, it's because although it is known, so may or may not know, that Himmler was trying to negotiate some kind of end to the war, some kind of like more palatable surrender with terms as opposed to unconditional surrender, which was rejected. But the fact of his trying to negotiate basically made him an exile and had him sentenced to death in absentia by Hitler. But I think through the circle of friends, Britain was kind of keeping their options open about that being something that either they could work with, or that it was something that they felt they had to deal with for one reason or another. And then after everything was tracked down and it was no longer an actual useful bargaining chip, I think they, for political reasons, wanted to have him killed, because he was basically a loose end who could cause some political damage. That's my take. I don't really have that much, other than the data points, I don't really have much to substantiate the motivations, but that's how I piece things together. But anyway, that was kind of a side point to what's going on with Scorsese, because although there is a theory that Scorsese might have come into some of this, some of these assets. So I believe the circle of friends is predominantly where some of these, the stockpiles of National Socialist gold, for example, that people talk about from time to time, trains full of gold that are supposedly stashed in mountains and things. I think the circle of friends is primarily where that comes from, because they spent some amount of unofficial effort in trying to secure stockpiles of various assets. And I think there's or at least I would be very open to the possibility that Scorsese came into some of that, or that it was used by the CIA or the Galen organization, because all three of these groups seem to have money that they shouldn't otherwise. But aside from that, it is also known that Otto Scorsese in particular was involved in basically a very late in the day bank heist, where I can't remember if it was the central bank or just another major bank, I believe in Berlin, in April 1945. They basically just stormed in and took everything that was like fairly mobile. So they took things like precious jewels and I believe foreign exchange reserves, but not the gold, because the gold was too heavy, basically. And they just sort of stashed it around in places that they thought that they might be able to come back to. And I believe Scorsese is the guy that either got most or all of it, because like I said, he shows up later with massive amounts of money. The way that he actually gets out is quite curious, because although he is captured and he is undergoing the war crimes trials, he is effectively just busted out in essentially broad daylight by, depending on who you ask, either Americans who give him an American uniform and they basically just drive out, or SS men in stolen uniform. Now he himself claims throughout that it was Americans. It wasn't actually it wasn't actually people in stolen uniforms that busted him out. But one way or another, he gets out and he makes his way to Madrid, I believe it is, the first. Yes, I think so, but you'd have to double check that. He ends up in Madrid anyway. Like I said, he has a lot of money, and that becomes his base of operations. And not least because it has been made known ahead of time that Franco will basically. So kind of everyone knows about Argentina, but also in the European context, there's Franco who is also basically holding open arms to anyone who wants to, come and form basically be a right-wing safe haven. So Spain is going to be a recurring feature with a lot of these groups because it becomes one of the central nodes. And Otto Skorzeny is one of the central features. He ends up investing a lot of money into trying to make sure that other people can follow through some of these escape routes, and they tend to go through. So I think there's a couple of routes involving primarily Croatians, Italians, and Germans, and they ship people off to either, like I said, Spain or Argentina, or South America, particularly Argentina, or Egypt and Syria. So Egypt in particular bears explaining because, especially after Nasser's rise to power, the Egyptians kind of have a certain legacy. Philia, I guess, for the National Socialists, if only because the original failed putsch attempt in, I think it was 1940, was essentially supported / somewhat sponsored by the Germans, and Nasser himself, I think, was involved as a junior officer in that, but he kind of gets skipped over for reprisals because he wasn't a big enough player. But yeah, once he's in charge, there's an interest in bringing Germans on. I don't know whether there's like any kind of ideological philia there or anything like that.
I think well, as context for it, with what little I know about such things, certainly, as you know, and many listeners will, the Germans and the Turks were closely allied in the First World War, and Ataturk himself kind of set the model for a republic guaranteed by the military as a sort of transitional form of government on the way from the imperial structures to the nationalist ones. And for the Ottoman Empire, you sort of had the northern pole and central one of Anatolia with its more concentrated Turkic populations, and then sort of at the other end of it, as you had throughout history, north and south with the Levant in between, you had Egypt, and that kind of balance goes back to the Hittites at one end and ancient Egypt at the other. But of course, in the 19th century, you see things with Muhammad Ali as a semi-autonomous governor in Egypt, and of course the Porte to the north in Anatolia. At any rate, Ataturk becomes a model for these sort of military dictatorships that are used to transition former imperial regions into nationalist entities. And so, of course, you have the background with the Baathists as well, who are essentially, Arab national socialists. And so there would seem to be some clear relationship there or some sort of relationship. I shouldn't say clear, I suppose, but running from Turkish and Ottoman cooperation over to transitional forms of nationalism that take on more or less explicit National Socialist characteristics. I think the last of those Ba'athist regimes was the one in Syria, which has just now disappeared.
Yes, I believe so. I must admit, I'm not as well versed on the background of Baathism per se, but I just sort of know this data point that people like Scorsese and ex National Socialists and ex SS guys end up in Syria and Egypt in particular as military advisors, or sometimes even just general technical advisors. I guess it's arguable whether or not that's a legitimate position, or whether it's something that's basically just a cover to give them a way of getting out and being protected.
Certainly interesting in terms of shifting Egypt's alliances, or the sort of center of gravity in terms of Egypt with the rest of Europe, with the Suez affair and the United States getting involved there, and Britain being increasingly sidelined. If you wanted, I'm just wildly speculating here, but if you wanted to do things in Egypt, but they might be things that your ostensible ally, Britain, would have problems with. And of course, Britain has this long history of influence in Egypt. Then you might do it through people like Scorsese, or through the Galen network or whatever.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's funny you should mention that, because for Scorsese in particular, one of the explicit reasons why he's brought in by Egypt is to train against a hypothetical, to train explicitly against Britain, basically. So he's training a combination of the Egyptian military and Egyptian irregulars that obviously come into play during Suez to fight specifically Britain. That is the explicit aim. So yeah, I mean, I point back to this question mark over the extent to which it is centralized and coordinated. Because yes, if you were America and you wanted to knock Britain down a few pegs, then doing so via like two or three different steps of intermediary bodies, so that it's only very loosely connected to you, is probably the smart way to go about it. But at the same time, with that degree of separation, you could also, I would say, make a pretty good argument that it's sort of difficult to control the actions of people that's separated.
Especially when you have the Israelis operating nearby in a freshly minted state. And these are Israelis who have apparently an axe to grind with Britain for not having delivered on the promise of the Balfour Declaration, and who have jumped ship and basically put their money on the table with the United States. And I am convinced, with a considerable degree of resentment towards Britain. One of my working hypotheses is that the Israelis have long been pissed off that they made what they saw as a deal for a nation, generally around the period of the Balfour Declaration, in agreement with Britain, and then they didn't feel like they quite got it, and so they shifted to the United States in the period of World War II, and afterwards it emerged that they had some form of international recognition. So I just throw that in there. I'm not saying it's not the United States, and certainly not saying that it's all Israel, but I think you would see an overlap and a sort of shared interest there.
Yeah, the dynamic between another power as well to bring up is France in that equation in particular, because I believe from independence until, I want to say, the 60s, probably like 63 or 65, something like that. I believe France was the main arms exporter to Israel. But even at that point, Israel was trying to chart more of a neutralist course. So, the Britain versus America dynamic is, at least from what I know, slightly harder to pass. But it is also worth remembering, especially in the context of this conversation, that they were straddling the western-eastern line as well. So you've got two different traditions in Israel. You have the right-wing, more, I think, urban settler. Maybe I'm not quite sure of like what internal divides there are there. But you got your properly rightist terrorist groups. The ones that are more famous for fighting against
Irgun.
Yeah, exactly. But then at the same time, you've got things like the kibbutzes and some of the socialist influence that's coming through there, and the kind of Soviet philia that's there due to, well, that's kind of where a lot of the leftist Zionists end up, in those the communal kibbutzes, I believe.
Yes, but you're also very, very. It's very, very good that you bring up France, because I tend to leave that out. I mean, the original agreement to carve up that region, is the Sykes-Picot agreement. Of course, France has a long sort of colonial history in the region, places like Lebanon. So yeah, and I tend to leave France out, and I think I do so to the detriment of my understanding of things. So thanks for putting that back into the mix.
Well, it's probably a good time to bring up France more broadly then into this whole thing. We're kind of jumping around, but it seems like the most logical way to approach this sort of whole dropped spaghetti mess that I'm trying to sort of chart out. I kind of wish I'd been able to put together a one of those crazy red string
octopus graphic.
Yeah, or the no, what's it called? The spider's web, I think it's called. With all the red
red string and post-it notes
between. Yeah.
It's so bored. Yes,
exactly. Anyway, so France is interesting because post-war they essentially try to so they make an example of the most egregious examples of collaborationism, but at a general level they try to basically just reintegrate the elements that were pro-Vichy, or the elements that were sort of more ambivalent towards the whole thing. And what they end up with is a situation, curiously enough, especially in French Algeria, as I understand it, that is more kind of at conflict with itself. It's not there's not necessarily a whole lot of settled questions there, and sometimes you've got groups that are kind of overtly, you could almost say like neo-Nazi. So in particular, I believe Young Nation is one of them. That is a lot more on the side of just like outright pro National Socialism. But you also have just running the gamut between all various flavors of integral nationalism, like royalism. Action Français has kind of only just been petering out after this point, but actually, while I'm on that point, one of the organizations that was considered a successor is a group called I think they're called Cité Catholique, Catholic City, basically, but in French. And they were formed out of, I guess you could say, the ashes of Action Français. I mean, I know the organization still exists today, but the secretary to Charles Marat, I believe, sets up Cité Catholique, and basically intends to use secret society methods, such as those used by the French far-right pre-war, to basically try to put people into relevant positions. So they're essentially a very radical Catholic traditionalist organization, but with an extreme emphasis on anti-leftism, especially anti-communism. And they basically try to infiltrate various organizations, especially the military, which already had a tradition of, at least so the officer class in particular, had a tradition of pious Catholicism, basically. Even while the rest of the government was kind of flirting with socialism at various points. This becomes more relevant, especially going into the colonial wars. So in France, they decide quite quickly that they do not want to allow conscripts, because they maintain a conscript army for quite a while. They don't want to be sending conscripts over to fight in Indochina and eventually Algeria as well. So only the professional forces can go over there. And one of the things that does is starts to create a very definite difference in culture between both of these groups. So you have the conscript army, and you have the wider civilian population, and then you have the professional army, who have also been infiltrated by some of these groups. At the same time, they are witnessing events going on in China. They're very, very impacted by what happens in China with the success of Mao Zedong, and they are quite taken by, I believe it was in particular his book on guerrilla warfare. He basically writes a guide to guerrilla warfare, and it does the rounds, and the French are quite taken with it, and they want to basically adapt a similar kind of thing, but using it for the forces of counter-revolution, you could say, or the forces of the West. This kind of evolves into like a whole school of counterinsurgency warfare that is characterized by ideological commitment to, you could say, like Westism. I mean, some of it takes on racial characteristics and more ideological components as well, but at a fairly low resolution level, you could say that it's basically just an extreme philia towards the idea of the West. I think that's, while we're there, it's probably worth mentioning that's probably one of the things that survives better than most of the ideas that we're going to end up talking about, and the organizations themselves as well. But yes, so that's a very popular set of ideas that is floating around in the French military cadres and the French officer class in particular. But it kind of seeps quite heavily into the professional military as well, with their developing a completely parallel culture. And especially after the failure in Indochina, the professional military starts kind of feeling like, in particular in that case, they feel like they were let down by the political leadership. So the war was winnable, but the politicians basically, I'll use the term, stabbed them in the back, because it's the same kind of idea, really, when you get down to it in a certain sense. So that whole attitude gets pivoted into Algeria, and basically the attitude in Algeria is that they will not allow the same thing to happen again. So they have a much more committed attitude towards the French imperial project, and to some extent an axe to grind with the political leadership. At the same time, where they're waging this, I guess you could say, quite brutal war in Algeria. So, in particular, it is considered completely valid within the French military at this time to use things like extreme psychological warfare and torture. They even had a scheme to essentially infiltrate the FLN, the Algerian National Algerian Front, or something like that. No, National Liberation Front, I think it translates to. So, the main antagonistic faction in the Algerian War. They would infiltrate those groups and basically plant false orders and implicate various members in false betrayals. And some estimates say that hundreds, if not possibly thousands, of executions and incidents of torture were attributable to the fact that the French military intelligence had basically infiltrated these groups and framed them for things that they didn't do. So they just ended up tearing themselves apart on the inside. And this whole movement, it should be said, has a definite impact on the American conduct in Vietnam as well. Sorry, go on.
Having taken over there from the French, who weren't doing so well, and the Australians fitting into the mix. I just wanted to point out, you certainly know this, and most of the listeners do, but of course we again see the overlap between sort of the overlap with the Western European colonial versus anti-colonial story, but of course also the idea of Western nations versus the communists, because of course Algeria was strongly supported by the Soviet Union in all of this, and indeed the relationship between Russia and Algeria persists to this day. So just another, just to underscore the way in which the right wing is the colonial versus anti-colonial story overlaps with the anti-communist story and the struggle in that respect.
Yeah, that's a good point to pick up, actually. That I guess it's unfortunate that we didn't mention it sooner, but coming up to an hour in now, it's probably worth mentioning that when we're talking about right-wing movements in this context, we are talking in the same vein of this, wars of like East versus West idea. We're kind of just talking about the hardest edge, maybe, of the Westerners, and that's not necessarily because there was never any ideological content there, and or there weren't any genuine right-wing ideas backing it up. But at some level, it kind of gets reduced down to a anti-communist soup at some level.
Well, that in large part would be a way to rebrand the right-wing movements in a way that was more palatable in the context of the Cold War. I think that was there were certain explicit decisions made in Italy, with the Movimento Sociale Italiano, where they, sort of explicitly discuss shifting that emphasis from, right-wing or pro-fascist or neo-fascist to anti-communist. Of course, in the case of North Africa, it's a rather interesting story because, of course, de Gaulle, for a time, he organized his resistance out of North Africa when he was on the outs. And, he's considered a fairly right-wing figure, of course, by many in France. And, his strategic positioning of France survives to some extent to this day, though France has now joined NATO. The idea of France having a more independent position and its own nuclear deterrent. So you can see sort of the nationalist aspect there. But at the same time, there was a total folding in terms of what was going on in Algeria, which led to the Pieds Noirs, the Blackfeet, the French colonials, large numbers of them absolutely despising de Gaulle. So you've got a situation where you've got nationalism, but there is in fact a retreat from North Africa. And then it's interesting, I'm not quite sure how it might fit into the story, but of course everyone knows that Franco was in North Africa before he headed back to Spain to do the things that he did with the Spanish Civil War. And so to some extent, it seems like the colonial forces were in some respect the most, if not nationalistic, they were the most imperial, perhaps the most right-wing from, right-wing in quotes, from that perspective. On the other hand, you see a lot of these Pieds Noirs who end up in France, as we were talking about before we went live. A large number of them in France are Jews. Zemmour is a more right-wing Pieds Noirs, descended from Jews in North Africa. But on the other hand, Mélenchon is a former Pieds Noirs. And it's worth mentioning that there was a very significant French Jewish population in North Africa, and a not insignificant one in North African Spain. So I'm not sure if or how that might fit into our story, but it seems worth mentioning as well.
Yeah, the funny thing about Mélenchon in particular is that he probably would have been a hardcore OAS supporter if he'd still if he'd been alive at the time. We'll get into that briefly, but we'll get into that shortly, rather. But so you've touched on a lot of things that we're just about to get to, basically. So all of this discontent with the French government eventually brings down the Fourth Republic. The military and the Pied Noir in particular support de Gaulle in his successful coup, and he is whisked off to Paris on the understanding that he is going to maintain the French position in Algeria and bring the Algerian war to a successful conclusion to the satisfaction of the military and the Pied Noir. But what he does, and to their credit, he kind of makes some very vague statements that is what he intends to do. And I believe he's supposed to have chanted "Vive Algérie," Algérie Français, I believe, which was basically the slogan of the idea that Algeria will be kept as a French possession. But I think he might have taken some prompting to do that. By people who are suggesting that he read the room and say what is necessary to be said, because basically as soon as he gets to Paris, almost first thing on the agenda is effectively capitulation in the Algerian war. And so on the back of that, shortly afterwards, there is Barricades Week, as it is known, where effectively the civilian population, that is to say the civilian Pied Noir population, effectively rise in revolt and bring the city to a standstill, bring French Algeria to a standstill. I believe in multiple cities, but definitely in Algiers itself. The military were kind of expected to step in and basically take that as the trigger for a coup. A second coup to overthrow General de Gaulle in the face of his, as they saw it, betrayal. But that does not pan out. There are a lot of people in the military who are sympathetic to their position, and there's even people on the front lines who are basically ordered to put an end to Barricades Week that are sympathetic to their position. But I think you could probably argue that they're taken by surprise, but one way or another they don't end up getting involved. So the people who essentially organised Barricades Week, most of them just end up going into exile. Funnily enough, to Spain once again. They end up in Madrid. A general who effectively takes their side, Raoul Salan, he is almost like the archetypal figure that I was talking about previously of these professional French officers who have internalized the lessons of the counterinsurgency school, whilst also being a fairly decorated veteran of these failed colonial wars, despite personally doing fairly well most of the time in them. So very much feeling aggrieved by the civilian government, and so Salan links up with two of the main instigators of the Barricades Week and two of the main leaders, and forms the OAS, Organisation Armée Secrète, I think, if you excuse the horrendous pronunciation. Secret army organization, basically. I've seen conflicting reports as to whether the Algiers putsch is organized by Salan or, effectively by a cadre of other officers who are, equally dissatisfied, but not in exile. They remain in the French army. But one way or another, they gather a load of officers, particularly, I believe it was General Chalet, who is essentially the face of it. And they have the Foreign Legion paratroopers, who are basically at this point pretty like the most fanatical edge of the kind of culture that I've been describing, refusing to concede French Algeria. And they launched the Algiers Putsch. Now, contrary to the name it has, and contrary to how it's remembered, it was not supposed to be confined to French Algeria. It was supposed to be a much wider-ranging affair, but essentially ahead of time, all the figures who were considered to be of somewhat dubious political loyalty were sent off to West Germany to essentially, staff the divisions that were over there on the Soviet front to prevent them from being too close to political events where they might be most incendiary. So the intention was essentially always to try to activate some of those elements, and the OAS. I'm not sure about the putschists themselves had organized much, but the OAS had definitely organized civilian elements to basically be involved in whatever movement was going to take place on the continent. But nothing ever came of it because the putschists never managed to get out of Algeria. But
now, I seem to I have in my notes here because I was just trying to prepare myself to be able to keep up with you. Apparently, Skorzeny comes back into the picture here relative to the OAS. Is that correct? Just to show how some of these elements connect. I'm not sure if it's quite at this time.
My understanding was that Skorzeny actually gets involved with the OAS somewhat later. But what have you found?
Just that
Okay.
that he was that the OAS received some training from Skorzeny via his Paladin group. So I imagine that's very late, probably the 70s.
Yes.
But it also seems as though the CIA indirectly supported the OAS in some respects, which raises some interesting questions because, perhaps it wasn't about Algeria at all. Perhaps it was a game designed to depose de Gaulle, who was, whatever else can be said about him, charting a more independent course for France that, might not have been appreciated by the factions and forces which had emerged victorious in World War II.
So I do believe that comes into play later, but early on, I think it has probably more to do with the fact that the CIA. So okay, yes, I'll lay out the data first and then give my take on it. Basically, there are reports that even during the Algiers Putsch, there were Americans involved. In particular, the CIA was accused of having boots on the ground in some form, but sort of left quite early when they saw that it wasn't going to come to a successful conclusion. And then later, with the OAS, once the putsch fails, it's put down just to get to where the OAS become more relevant. So all of these units that had taken part, they are disbanded, but quite a significant portion of their ideologically motivated manpower just desert basically, and they end up becoming part of the OAS, especially the harder edge of the OAS that is carrying out things like assassinations, bombings, and all that kind of thing. I can't remember what they're called now. They have the deltas, I think, the delta groups, which are the actual armed bands that are conducting, you might say, kinetic operations. Yes, and then even at that stage, the CIA is alleged to have been involved. But one feature that I think is going to be recurring is that whilst the CIA do seem to have been involved with the OAS, as soon as it came to light, like somewhat more publicly, that they were officially getting involved, they were basically given a slap on the wrist by the State Department, and then, by extension, the presidency to stop what they're doing and rein their necks in. That it was inappropriate for their, it was unbefitting of America to support them.
Yes, naughty. Do you happen to know whether or not Britain played any role in any of this?
I don't, but I don't know at what stage they get involved, but I believe the Galen organization is involved with the OAS as well. And I say that not least because some of the personnel who disappear off the radar, so in particular, Antoine Argud, he actually ends up being discovered once again in Bavaria. And he was one of the people who was associated with one of the OAS plots to assassinate de Gaulle.
Curiouser and curiouser.
Indeed. The Galen organization itself was also involved in the Algerian war at an earlier stage, definitely as well, because they were. So not only did they have monitoring of the FLN, I believe they were actually helping by providing arms in some capacity. I'm not, you'd have to come up with a theory as to why that, why they were doing that, whether it was some kind of antagonism towards France, because that was basically always an accusation against the Galen organization, that they were, fomenting a continuation of Franco-German rivalry, in particular against de Gaulle. That would make more sense because they can do so, basically on America's behalf. But there were, essentially persistent rumors and sometimes even accusations that they were taking actions against the interests of France. But equally, if they are working for a perhaps a more hardline solution to the Algerian war, then if they were selective about who they were providing arms for example, or providing support for through their agents, then that bolsters the countervailing forces against the FLN as well, and by extension diminishes the more moderate elements that came into play with the Evian Accords, and indeed before the Evian Accords for that matter. Those being the negotiations to bring the war to an end.
Yes, it seems you could. Yeah, you can also certainly just make the case that keep your enemies close in order to be able to monitor what's happening and to have points of contact, intelligence gathering to bring influence to bear. But yeah, I certainly don't know. It's just it's a subject I just don't know enough about.
Yeah. So at their height, the OAS is a fairly short-lived thing. It basically tries to derail the Evian Accords as they're going on, and then try to reignite the war essentially after the agreement is basically finalized, and but it's not yet come into play. They have they burn brightly, but very briefly. I think in a fairly short time. I can't remember how long it was. If you can find the exact time span, that'd be helpful. But I think they managed to kill somewhere in the region of like 2,000 people in that time.
Yeah, I'll take a look. I know it's the 1960s, of course, but let me see if I can find that. Let's see what Wikipedia has to say. Founded in 61 by the aforementioned Raoul Salan, and also Pierre Lagaillarde and Jean-Jacques
Susini.
Oui, but let's see. Terribly sorry, it's just taking me a moment here. With the arrest of Guy Bouchier in 1965, the organization effectively ceased to exist. So yeah, just a 4-year run.
And most of that was when they were basically inactive. Their official founding in Spain is not really aligned to when they were actually an effective on the ground organization. Incidentally, they're probably worth studying sort of on their own as they're probably the closest thing. I guess we've kind of already put a spanner in that idea before I've even been able to voice it, but as probably as close to a kind of ground up organization as it goes, especially with like on the ground presence. But as I've said, there were governments involved at a relatively early stage. Obviously, the fact that they were in Spain and basically given cover by Spain to not extradited or anything, despite the fact that Spain was trying to court France as a patron for its entry into the proto. I can't remember if it was actually the EU at that point, or if it was just the
the coal and
European Economic Community. I think it was something.
Yeah, but there was also EU coal and it was an energy concern.
Yes, that was much earlier. That was just France and Germany before it was expanded.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Your EEC in the beginning there. Yes.
Yes. So that comes into play because the Pierre Lagaillarde again, probably butchering his name horribly, he and the Spanish section of the OAS end up being, essentially taken into captivity as a favor to the French of sorts, because they're at that point starting to cause the French some headaches. Well, de Gaulle in particular, the Gaullists, and so they're not above temporarily abolishing their status as a what you might call a right-wing safe haven in the interest of Spanish economic concerns or whatever it might be. That's going to be relevant later, but so essentially the OAS, just in terms of like how popular they were as well, which is an interesting point in itself. It's estimated that about 20% of the Pied Noir were fully in favor of the OAS. 60% were sort of tacitly in favor. Even if they might not necessarily like the methods, but they were in favor of the goal, and they were seeing the OAS as basically the only people who had their back. And then it was only about 20% who were against, or even just more so ambivalent towards them.
Probably reflects the same sort of proportions you see with the attitudes of Muslims in Europe towards Muslims who take radical or violent action.
I would not be surprised. But the extra interesting thing, and I brought up Mélenchon earlier and his likely affiliations, because funnily enough, the Pied Noir neighborhood that was actually the most robust stronghold of OAS activity was I think it was called Bab el Oud. Once again, butchering the pronunciation, sorry for that. But it was the working class Pied Noir communist stronghold in in Algiers in particular. And they flipped very hard, you might say, to the right in that capacity, because if it has not been made clear already, the OAS was quite a hard-edged organization, not just in its methods, but also in its ideological content, such as it was. So although it didn't necessarily, so the racial overtones that it did have were kind of more generalized. So you mentioned the Jewish involvement, which, the Jews that were there were kind of lumped in with the Pied Noir, so they were going to suffer more or less the same kind of reprisals as the Pied Noir were once the Algerians took over, and so saw the writing on the wall, as it were.
And dispossession. These are people whose families have been there in many cases for a century or more, and they have economic concerns and property, and all that's gone.
Funnily enough, just as a quick aside, I believe so. The initial settlement of French Algeria was, I think it started in the 1830s, I think, possibly slightly earlier. So it goes back quite a way. But the Jews that were there, so some of them did migrate later, but there was a population of them living in Algeria even beforehand, and they were basically given the choice of continuing to exist under the legal system that they had prior, or basically just become full-fledged, legal French citizens. And the Jews, by and large, chose, so unlike the Muslims, who by and large chose to continue their traditional practices, the Jews mostly chose to become full-fledged French citizens. And so you could say that quite a few of them would have had ties to Algeria that go back many centuries indeed.
Yeah, but presumably some of them, I think they were primarily Sephardi and or Sephardim, and so being expelled from Spain would probably be a part of that story for some of them. I think Don Browning mentioned in the chat the Crémieux decree, granting French nationality to Jews.
Yes, exactly. Oh, was that earlier? Actually, I don't remember. It doesn't matter.
I'll have a look. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So the OAS they waged this short, sharp campaign, ultimately unsuccessfully, trying to maintain French presence in or maintain French Algeria, and when that fails, and basically the entire Pied Noir population is, more or less, well, they're not carted out. They more or less leave of their own accord because they know exactly what's going to happen if they stay behind.
Oh, by the way, that decree was 1870, of course, much earlier. I'm embarrassed not to have known that. But yeah, go on.
No, that's after colonization. So yes, that would probably be, yeah, that would be relevant. Either way. So yes, the OAS fail. Some of them are essentially recognized on the way out, and they are pulled aside by Algerian FLN checkpoints, and are more or less never seen again. But many of them do get away. Some go to France, and the ones that do primarily end up settling in southern France, particularly in Provence, in and around Marseille. They have a bit of a rough time of it, especially the adjustment at first, because not only do they bring nothing, but some of them try to basically keep up the same kind of OAS lifestyle, such as it was, which tended to involve things like bank robberies. But that was looked on much less favorably without a significantly well-disposed population, a civilian population who was willing to, not only turn a blind eye to such things in the name of the cause, but actively support them. The ones who don't end up in France are more interesting, though, especially to the story, because as you've sort of already mentioned, they quite a lot of them end up in Spain. And although the OAS organization itself gets pretty much, I think they have a few more attempts on de Gaulle's life after the fall of French Algeria. I think there's 2 more attempts on his life by OAS members, or former OAS members. The organization itself more or less disintegrates. But it's replaced by groups such as, again, a revitalized version of this organization that I mentioned earlier, Cité Catholique. But they start to rub shoulders more and more with various other figures who are in this Spanish milieu, such as you mentioned, Otto Skorzeny. But not only that, they get folded into the Gladio networks. So the OAS guys, who are kind of, a lot of whom are enjoying this life of adventure, because one other thing worth bearing in mind, so the original cadre of Deltas, the people who were at the hard edge of the OAS, they tended to be veterans. They were legionnaires mostly, parachutist legionnaires, so some of the elite of the French army, so it was considered, and some of the most battle tested and professional people around. So yeah, they made life hell for their opponents when they were operating, but gradually over time they accepted more and more youths, basically like 16-year-old, well, maybe not 16, but teenagers, basically Pied Noir teenagers who were essentially plied with the adoration of women, drugs, and basically whatever their hearts desired within the context of an adventurer lifestyle, and given a gun and told to go and shoot some political opponents, or indeed some racial opponents, as it transpired sometimes. And yeah, a lot of those guys got very comfortably brought into what you would, now that we're finally getting to what you might call the international right, they got folded very comfortably into this organization and ended up being the foot soldiers of a lot of this kind of stuff. So they end up everywhere from Italy to Rhodesia, South Africa, Mozambique and Angola, Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia, basically all these various places.
Lebanon, presumably.
Yes, Lebanon as well. So Lebanon is an interesting case. Yeah, okay, we'll go into that now quickly. So basically, the Christian Phalangists during the what's called the Lebanese Civil War, they end up falling into this same kind of dichotomy that so many other groups are, where there is a dividing line that is drawn between those who are affiliated with the East and those who are affiliated with the West. Israel, I believe, is one of the places that weaponizes this most consciously and effectively. By my reading of events, there probably are other valid readings, but the Israelis are very cognizant of the fact that I mentioned before that in Syria and Egypt, a lot of German technicians are being brought over to provide assistance. They're advisors, and in some cases like scientists and whatever. Egypt having its own version of Operation Paperclip, and the Soviet equivalent. I can't remember what the operation name is, but they did have an equivalent. Israel is very concerned about things like so in particular, they end up being most concerned about the rocketry projects that are being pursued by Egypt, with various German scientists being brought over and technicians. Scorsese is one of the main people who is facilitating this, as I said. So he's the guy that has a lot of money and is basically dedicated to bringing out some of these types of guys to be out of the frying pan of Germany, and trying to avoid the West, of in some cases out of Europe entirely, and trying to make a life for themselves either in South America. There is some speculation that there was kind of some long-term intent to turn South America into the continuation of National Socialist Germany, effectively, but it's kind of hard to tell how much of that is basically just propaganda or fan fiction, and how much of it is real. But it's something worth considering. So some of the guys end up there, and in the meantime, some of them end up in the Middle East as well. But once again, I believe unsubstantiated theory of mine, to lay that caveat out there, but I believe Israel, when they were trying to essentially head off this threat, they were allowed by Franco, who was a Philo-Semite, I believe, to operate in Spain with more or less a free hand. And so they paid Scorsese a visit and made clear to him that he would cooperate with them and essentially flip that international rightist network to be working for their benefits rather than for the Arabs. And I believe that's kind of along the kind of timeline where the Arabs start slipping more into the
orbit of the USSR.
Yes, the Soviet orbit. Perhaps not necessarily purely by choice, as is kind of portrayed, but because they are kind of losing out on many of what the tacit benefits would have been of siding with the West.
That's a very interesting point that had just never occurred to me. I just underscored the way in which the Ba'athist movements, were supported by Germany, and then sort of whole post-Ottoman context. And yet I had never bothered to think to myself, well, why in the hell would they be natural allies of the USSR? Or why would the USSR be a natural ally of theirs to the extent, that we saw develop with Egypt, for example? Yeah, wow. It's time for me to think rather than just accept, disconnected snippets of historical facts. Yeah, thank you.
Well, once again, there might be more data in here that I'm not perceiving or not aware of, but based on what I know. So again, it's the thing that makes most sense to me, given that Scorsese is one of the people. He does not really come across, reading his background, he does not come across as an opportunist. I believe he joins the National Socialists quite early, and he's a fairly committed figure, let's say, to that movement. And while you can certainly make the valid claim that there is no reason why the Israeli state cannot be supported by National Socialists. From the perspective of, well, they kind of wanted them to be away in Israel in the first place. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. With World War I, as I've observed before, it was pointed out, at least as early as the 1940s in some books I had read, but I had never thought about it myself until I saw that. And it makes a bunch of pieces fall into place. To say it very quickly, the Zionist movement in German-speaking countries, which is really where it came up, had its eyes on the German relationship with the Ottoman Empire as being the most likely path for them to see the realization of, formerly recognized territory in their ancestral lands. And it makes perfect sense. The Ottomans are allies of the Germans. You have a lot of Zionists supporting the government in Germany in World War I, and fighting in the German army. And then they sort of changed their mind. And probably it has quite a bit to do with the Balfour Declaration and the way in which the appearance of the Balfour Declaration, this is my hypothesis, led the, let's say, American Jewish financial and media powers in the United States to lift their veto. You see the Balfour Declaration, then you see the United States suddenly come into the war in World War I on the side of the Allies. Then you have people like Mustache Man in Germany who are really pissed off at Jews and see them as having betrayed Germany. And part of that story can be understood if you recognize that the Jews had enjoyed some promise, whether it would eventuate or not, I don't know, of getting what they wanted if they stuck with Germany. And then after the Balfour Declaration, supposedly they're going to get it from Britain. They're pissed off because they don't fully. And then with World War II, you see what I think of as Hitler's attempt to step around that group of problems by endorsing the whole Havre agreement, which was indeed about resettlement there with, if not the support, at least the participation of the German government, who, of course, got to take a piece of what those emigres left behind. So from that perspective, I'm sorry, that was a long-winded way of going into it, but it does seem that there would be every reason for, if I'm right about all that, and I think I probably am, and again, it's not an idea I came up with, it's just an old one that has been submerged for a while. If I'm right about that, then there would be an argument to be made for certainly committed German National Socialists to think the easiest way out of this problem is to just help them get a place of their own.
Yeah, I mean, well, even when the Middle East was off the table, they tried with Madagascar, although obviously that would be a much less appealing prospect. But yeah, the first, their espoused aim is to just move them off somewhere else rather than to necessarily do anything more extreme. But anyway, that is a side point, because the alternative that I've laid out, which also seems probably more likely to me, if anything, is that Mossad made a calculated play to threaten Skorzeny and try to flip his organization and associated groups onto their side instead. And one of the ways that manifests is by him assassinating another fellow ex-SS member, I believe, certainly a German emigre, and I cannot remember his name right now. So if you could quickly Google that, he was a German rocket scientist in the service of Egypt. It's quite a scandalous point, because Otto Skorzeny working for Mossad, but that's kind of what makes the most sense to me. But also an example of this this kind of reduction down of what might have been some kind of more nuanced ideological position into a general kind of anti-East soup. But it's even more curious in the context, like this whole flip is more curious in the context of, and you could perhaps even say more ingenious from the perspective of Israel, in that it also puts groups that had been explicitly trained and affiliated with German instructors and advisors, most of whom were ex-Wehrmacht, ex-SS, etc., like the PLO. It puts them more firmly in the Eastern camp, despite there not being a significant ideological content there that would be relevant to communism. But
I just found
with communists.
Indeed, and in terms of the question, I did find a reference to Skorzeny apparently being involved in the assassination of one Heinz Krug in Munich, but
yes, that's him.
The AI is saying that it was while he was working explicitly for the Mossad, but
yes,
I don't have time to dig down.
That's what I'm referring to, yeah. But my contention would be that he's doing that. Well, yeah, he's doing that under instruction from Mossad, but working for Mossad might be going too far, because to my mind he's either a general Western aligned player / an independent player that is most closely aligned with the West, or anti-communism more generally.
Well, we have a number of intertwining strands here that become more and more interesting, and again we're seeing the sort of theme of the shift in emphasis from neo-fascism or true believers continuing to fight for that cause. Perhaps in the beginning, just rebranding themselves because it's expedient, as anti-communists. But the way the pieces fall out on the board with what we were just talking about before, with the PLO or other, sort of Arab anti-colonialist movements or anti-Israel movements, anti-Zionist movements, beginning to align with the Soviet Union. So it's a consistent theme.
Yes, so to be clear, the PLO being the Palestinian Liberation Organization for anyone unaware, but it is also relevant, I guess, in some other ways, because we got to this via Lebanon. And Lebanon is a curious case where you can kind of see some of the, you see the ethnic tensions perhaps taking on more of an ideological component as well. So the bleed goes the other way. Not only is there a like dumbing down of pure ideological content, but there's also an infection, you might say, of ideological content into what is a purely ethnic conflict or religious conflict even. So you have Christian Maronites who are becoming phalangists, basically, due to the fact that they are in an ethnic conflict, an ethnic/religious conflict with primarily Sunni Palestinians who are affiliated with the PLO, which is taking on somewhat more of a communist trappings, if not necessarily in, you could say more anti-imperialist in the Soviet mold rather than communism per se.
Yes, and of course that whole region is a mess based on the sort of the problems that emerged out of that Imperial Ottoman context, where you have deterritorialized communities that basically just control regions or portions of neighborhoods, like even with the Bab el Oud, which came up earlier, and so there's a rich group of fractures into which wedges can be driven, and of course that continues to this day. Of course, everyone knows that, so I don't want to get too much into it, but it's worth tapping.
But yes, as you correctly said, and the reason why we got here in the first place is you get the odd situation where this Lebanese civil war on ethnic and religious lines ends up drawing in Italian neo-fascists, ex-OAS members who are, basically Pied Noir European colonists of French Algeria who are dispossessed. Many times, like oftentimes, they become like Catholic traditionalist extremists, like I said, but of an extremely militant sort, and ex-SS members fighting on behalf of Maronite Christians in Lebanon. It's a bizarre situation that comes up sometimes. And if we wanted to at least touch on how the connections get even more bizarre, these groups end up becoming affiliated with the, I believe it's the Global Anti-Communist League, don't remember the exact name now, but I think that's what it is, which is actually hosted from South Korea. And South Korea tries to basically position itself as the leading anti-communist force under initially Syngman Rhee and then his successor, whose name I also don't remember off the top of my head. But Syngman Rhee in particular is curious because he's essentially a handpicked US intelligence asset, and then basically goes on to shape South Korea around this idea even today. So even the coup that was it the coup attempt last year? Was it the most recent?
Yeah,
one?
that sounds right. Yes, I think it was last year. Certainly within the last 2.
Even the justification for that is on anti-communist grounds, and that is basically the justification for all previous South Korean coups, of which there have been quite a few, and attempts obviously even more so.
Yeah, that's a very interesting echo of the Prometheism, the Piłsudski's doctrine, which, at least for my part, I see very clearly reflected in the general strategic position of Britain, and then later the United States as a sort of inheritor of its strategies towards Russia. So, you have British advisors, closely, among others, of course, closely watching the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and at the same time, you've got a revolution breaking out in Russia, as we've discussed before, I believe, and we have Poland working with Japan. Today, we have bookending Russia essentially as a sort of Promethean strategy. And today, of course, we have South Korea signing contracts to produce and supply weapons to Poland, and the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, definitely. South Korea in that sense is interesting. I guess it's one of the other relic countries from this kind of you probably could say entire country. I mean, not so much a movement, but the entire structure of South Korea in some sense is sort of built on this idea of anti-communism, being like extremely Westphilic, but with a particular ideological lens for what that means, perhaps particular structure.
Yes, but at the same time, it persists in serving its strategic function. At least it seems so, regardless of whether or not Russia is considered communist today, or indeed China is considered fully so. So you see sort of how the same thing we see reflected here with the shift from neo-fascism to anti-communism. Well, now that anti-communism is not the ideological justification du jour, nevertheless, these regions continue to serve their same function quite dramatically in the case of Ukraine or Poland and South Korea, as I was just mentioning. And yet, interestingly enough, we do see the neo-fascist aspect reemerge, perhaps because it's no longer as useful to frame it as anti-communism. Now it can be neo-fascist nationalism again against the idea of the Russian imperialism. So it's very interesting how we see the ideological trappings kind of get swapped out here, while the fundamental geostrategic aspects remain central to the story.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder. So on the Russia point in particular, again, it's a bit of a digression, but I do wonder about the extent to which the Russophobia has been maintained as a more West Germany phenomenon, whereas East Germany maintained a sort of greater Russophilia. So can't help but notice Merkel being of East German extraction and being a Russophile of sorts.
Or the relative proportion, the electoral patterns in Germany, vis-a-vis the AfD, for example. That seems to hold true.
Well, possibly more about... so yes, there's the electoral patterns, but that doesn't necessarily carry the same content in itself. I was more because the CDU obviously used to be CDU/CSU used to be much more ambivalent towards Russia in general. But so it's more. I would question whether it's more a factor of the individual personalities involved in leadership in that case. So again, pointing to Merkel in particular because she's an East German and has a very different view of Russia compared to somebody from West Germany. But yeah, yes. I don't know. Yes. Digression. So you do bring up the neo-fascists. That's probably a good time to segue on to how Italy features into all of this, because they're probably one of the groups that they're almost in a way defining of this whole epoch, because this whole topic, because although France, throws their weight around a lot more than you expect, Italy is one of the clearer cases where the previous movement gets absorbed much more completely. So the old fascists get they undergo a similar process of denazification, I believe. They are punished to some degree, but quite a lot of them are still able to sort of escape under the radar due to the civil, the civil war, and having a faction that emerged victorious from the war, essentially. So, some form of Italy essentially still won. And subsequently, the importance of Italy from a geographical perspective was sort of emphasized by American planners, and in particular Sardinia as a naval base, I believe. So Italy seems to have been one of the places that more so than many other locations was targeted for the NATO stay-behind forces, as they are seemingly mostly known. But they get in common parlance now, they get lumped under the single operation that is Operation Gladio. But Gladio, it refers specifically to Italy, and that's just because the Italian case, I think, is the first that was explicitly discussed and revealed in declassified documents in, again, I think about 1990, because some of the people, I believe, who were affiliated with the Years of Lead various bombings from the right were affiliated with the stay behind forces, which is a recurring pattern of sorts, or at the very least there are indications that various people were tied to the stay behind forces, of which there were many. So like I said, there's also Germany, Belgium, probably Britain, it's harder to say, France almost certainly, but we just have less information about those latter two. So in the Italian case, the Americans, so the communists kind of rebounded relatively quickly, I believe, not least because the fascist institutions that had been mostly keeping them in check were dismantled, and basically the general disposition was that anybody who was anti-fascist was a friend, and they kind of came to regret that disposition somewhat, as is again a recurring feature. But they then had to kind of pivot back to, okay, the communists are doing very, very well in the polls. They also have groups that are threatening to take more direct action in alliance with Moscow potentially. So, who are the people who are most familiar with countering communist subversion? Well, it happens to be the fascists, basically, and the successors to the fascists, who by this point had started to have some kind of changing of the guard, as it were. But many of the original personalities were still involved. Not necessarily the top level people, but some high profile figures who were nonetheless fairly politically more marginal, you might say. So Black Borghese is the headline figure usually talked about. I think he was one of the most high profile of the I guess you could say neo-fascists, but he was an original fascist. He was, I believe, he was in charge of the Frogmen, the Frogmen's special forces in the Italian Navy. and he was quite well regarded in that position. But he was also a committed fascist. There's a lot that is sort of okay. No, let me go back a second. Basically, yeah, these various figures they give a lot of conferences and are able to basically present themselves as the leading experts in counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare at the same time. Once again, this comes back to the French influence, because I can't prove any connections, but it seems too perfect that the French were heavily interested in this subject, and it also so happens that their compatriots over in Italy are holding the same kind of line and basically making hay of the same kinds of the same kind of ideas and expertise. So on the basis of this, you can maybe say as either a cover story or genuinely that they are able to play themselves off as basically these kinds of like leading experts. They are considered, they're basically brought into leading positions in Operation Gladio, and to some extent they're brought into the government, I believe, as well, as in a much more informal capacity. But certainly they're brought into groups like the P2 Lodge. Yeah, I believe it's P2, which is a Masonic lodge which came to be associated with basically all the various figures who were right-wing aligned, or at the very least anti-communist aligned. And this included everyone from politicians to intelligence personnel, lower-level fascists, even I believe some foreigners. So, for example, after the fall of French Algeria, Jean-Jacques Susini, who we mentioned earlier as one of the founding members of the OS, he ends up in Rome and becomes embroiled in these kinds of circles as well. I think he's associated with the P2. And people like Borghese as well. If I didn't mention also industrialists. So that would be one argument as to where they got the money, but potentially there's other sources. That's why I was careful to mention earlier that there are some of these assets that may have been sort of stowed around and that were either seized secretly, that were perhaps seized secretly by either American or pro-Western forces in some fashion. So they're able to fund themselves, and they get kind of associated with what is called the strategy of tension, which is the idea that they would present an unstable seeming situation which demands order be restored. So they do this through a combination of false flag attacks, it is alleged. I think that part's fairly proven. False flag attacks, bombings, sometimes in their own name, I believe, and try to encourage an atmosphere of instability so that it will be demanded that the forces of order step in. And as part of this whole process, and as part of the consideration that perhaps Italy is getting a little bit too unstable or a little bit too communist, that America was pressing for, either it is alleged that it is America, but it might not be. It might not be the CIA. It might not be America. It might not. It might be something that's a little bit more organic. But there were two very near coup attempts. One was in 1964, the piano solo plot by General Giovanni Di Lorenzo, and the second was Black Borghese, Prince Junio Valerio Borghese, with various neo-fascists, and that was in 1970. So a lot of the manpower for this is again coming from a combination of neo-fascists, of which they do have quite a robust organic presence. So you mentioned previously the MSI, the Italian social movement, but also they get an inflow of personnel. As I mentioned, people like Susini were bringing in OAS personnel, and although I've not seen any particular mention of it, I would be absolutely shocked if Scorsese and Galen were not also involved in some way.
And it seems that that there is some sort of at least partial overlap here with the OAS as well, if nothing else, via the shared anti-decolonization stance. But I'm not positive about that.
I'm not sure if Italy had as much of that, because the grounding of the Italian right has more to do with, I guess you could say, almost like fanatical alliance with the West. So they become almost, I guess you could say, almost one of the purest forms of like just anti-communism, nothing else. There is no specific ideological content that is necessary to be involved, other than to want to be affiliated with NATO and oppose the Soviet Union and Italian communists by extension. But the actual methodical approach to that is extreme, perhaps beyond measure, which is curious. And that's one of the, and I guess another thing that I think bleeds through to the present is, in that vein, I would not necessarily say that someone like a Giorgia Meloni, who was affiliated with these groups earlier in life and now gets tarred with being like not a proper rightist or something, I would not necessarily say that she's actually strayed all that much. Perhaps it is a completely honest representation of her original roots, in the sense that, okay, there might have been some more fiery rhetoric that kind of went with her earlier days, and fierier methods, but the core of the movement seems to basically just be no to communism. We align with America.
Yeah, there's certainly quite a history of that. Part of that, though, I don't know how much of that is organic versus how much of that has to do with how thoroughly involved the United States has been in Italy for quite some time. Well, since certainly the end of World War II, and the kind of opportunities that exist to do things sub rosa when you have a huge American Italian diaspora population, many of whom, in 1945 and the years immediately following, were new arrivals or first generation who still spoke Italian. My grandfather was in the U.S. military, and he didn't seem to have been involved in any combat, and most of what he did seems to have taken place in 1945 and 1946, if I remember correctly. So, he's a native Italian speaker. Don't really know what he did. Has a drawer full of all sorts of World War II military patches, none of which seem to correspond to any roles he played. So, yeah. But I'm not saying I disagree with you. I'm just throwing into the mix as well the possibility that the United States has just exercised a great deal of influence in Italy for quite some time.
Yeah, I mean, I laid out that caveat right at the start, with good reason, that quite a lot of this is open to speculation as to where the real levers are, and who's pulling them, how they're pulling them, and what is actually going on under the hood. Because sometimes you can only really see that you have a group of people who are pushing for something, and all sorts of theories as to who's behind that, and where the money's coming from, and who's the one that's actually whether certain things are earnestly believed, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, this is the specific area where you get official history, occasional leaks, and then you're left with just a huge room to hypothesize.
Indeed, exactly. So, on that note, we can jump quickly over to South America, because that's somewhere else where a lot of this stuff becomes relevant. And I don't know how much flow there is from South America back to the old world, but certainly there's flow from Europe into South America, because, as I said earlier, Galen and Scorsese funneled a lot of people over to Argentina, in particular, Perón was quite fond of picking up those people where he could. But a lot of them also ended up in Chile and Paraguay under Stroessner. I know quite a lot of them found refuge in Paraguay under Stroessner, and eventually Bolivia as well. So, in particular, one of the most notable things, one of their most notable bits of involvement was with I believe there was a coup in Bolivia in 1971, possibly. It's known as the cocaine coup, because there's a whole extra layer of this that I haven't mentioned so far, but I'll kind of take that as a segue point, is the connection to the drug trade. So some of these guys also had various connections to mafiosos and the drug trade in general, which once again comes back to how much American involvement was there. Because going back to the ending stages of the Chinese Civil War, you have the creation of the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia, basically as a way to fund and support the Kuomintang army in the southwest that had been forced out of China but was not able to retreat to Taiwan, like most of the rest of them did. So they basically just camped out in the jungles of Burma, possibly Thailand, Laos, that whole area, and I think a little bit in Yunnan where they could, just over the border, I believe, into China, mostly trying to prepare for some kind of invasion attempt or cross-border raids and things like that. But they supported themselves with the cultivation and selling of heroin, which was just facilitated by US intelligence. But I have to imagine, based on other things like, I don't know how much you know about the French connection in Marseille. Once again, coming back, the Pied Noir had a very large presence in Marseille, so I do wonder if there's some additional connection there. Them getting involved in that.
French Indochina and the rest.
Well, no, this would be after that. I believe the French connection is a little bit later, but I don't know too much about that personally. Just that seeing drugs, the OAS/Pied Noir, and organized crime all coalescing in a single city makes me suspicious of US influence.
Yeah. And Marseille is still a very exciting place to get robbed.
I'm sure.
Yeah, and sorry, that's apropos of nothing. We consistently see an overlap as well between secret societies, secret services, intelligence services, drugs, organized crime. It's I think the best way to think about the intelligence services in general is basically as organized crime. And you've got books, like Kitson's anti-gang works that frame a lot of the struggle for power, in terms of intelligence activities as being, one gang versus another. But again, I'm sort of wandering off. I know you have a lot of ground to cover.
No, it is relevant because I don't think I'm going to have that much time to really stretch out my elbows on the drug issue. But you're quite right, and it's something that's worth going into more. But I think it's just as an aside, it's another one of those cases that I kind of briefly mentioned earlier, where you see different elements of the US government kind of pressing up against one another and acting in direct contravention of one another, because you sometimes have essentially the CIA and the DEA effectively working at cross purposes. And I believe the case of Kiki Camarena was one of essentially the CIA putting out a hit on a DEA agent, but having the Mexican cartels be the triggermen on their behalf. I don't remember all the details of that, but that's a whole thing.
And just to go meta on it again, you can see a sort of clear continuity in terms of criminal activities as a source of funding with the the sort of bank robberies and things that you were mentioning in the beginning, carrying over to a more lucrative and ongoing process in terms of drug trade, which is then overlaps, of course, with the illicit transfer of funds and the arms trade and all the other concatenated things that we hear about so often today, wherever intelligence activities or color revolutions and covert activities are taking place.
Yeah, I mean, I try to make a point of bringing up the question marks over where certain people got their funding from, especially Otto Skorzeny in particular. But it's a more general point, is that the CIA in particular, especially if we're taking a top-down view of these things rather than viewing them as more decentralized, the CIA does have a certain amount of black budget that they're allowed to use for various things that are not going to show up in the public domain so much, and they can they have a certain amount of leeway for doing things secretly. But it's even more handy, one would imagine, to have money or access to funds that are completely off the books, or to have ways to pass money to groups which would not be seen so fondly. In particular, the East and West were constantly accusing each other of employing Nazis. And the funny thing is that they both did.
Well, when you want that expertise, when you want a job done right, hire a former National Socialist with plausible deniability. Sorry, that's not the official position of this channel or its guests. But yes, please go on.
But yes, as I've been trying to say, that all of this was done, again, if you believe it's all top down, with a good degree of plausible deniability, especially on the Western side, where there are 3, sometimes more degrees of separation between the who's potentially giving the orders and who's actually carrying them out on the ground. But yes, I guess that ties well to Operation Condor, potentially. Because it's one of those cases where you have ex-SS personnel. So notably, Klaus Barbie, I believe, is one of the more famous in the Bolivian case, but also in, I believe, Paraguay and possibly Argentina. But the OAS are getting involved as well. So, and there's a question mark over how much the US or even the CIA know about the details of what's going on, but you have to imagine at least a reasonable amount. That quite a lot of the South American dirty wars end up taking on and learning from the expertise of certain French officers who had gone through the school of counterinsurgency, we could call it. People who were either affiliated with the OAS or just affiliated with the Algiers Putsch and just skipped straight on. One way or another, they were acting as instructors and or direct on the ground personnel and trigger pullers to the what is now known as the Dirty Wars, and all of the various disappearances that were taking place in particular Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Bolivia. As I said, I'd be shocked if they didn't also show up in Peru, given the ongoing troubles with communists there, but I've not really seen as much of a direct connection there. But I believe even people like, although you have to imagine that if anyone is still kicking around, who was like a former SS guy in was it 1973 during the Pinochet coup, then they're probably a bit long in the tooth by that point. But supposedly some of them were still kicking around because, that's when. So you brought it up earlier, but Otto Skorzeny's Paladin group. That's kind of where all this comes to its most crystallized head, when you have Skorzeny actually directly heading an official organization, which is effectively a PMC, trying to be the connective tissue almost between a political paramilitary group and a PMC/military advisor based out of, I think it was Alicante or just outside of Alicante, something like that, employing predominantly former SS guys and OAS members, but with a few others mixed in, like I mentioned, the neo-fascists. So oftentimes that includes people like Delache. I believe he's one of the people that got around the most. I know he was involved in the coup in Bolivia, in particular, for example. He was a prominent neo-fascist and one of the main organizers behind the various the bombings in Italy. And I believe there's also occasionally sometimes people like we haven't gotten to Greece, but Greece is another like node in this whole thing, and potentially some Lebanese as well. Just basically everybody who you can imagine who's involved in this whole network. Anyone who we've mentioned today, they all end up basically supporting one another in various endeavors, both in the old world and the new.
Yeah, I saw a mention. I didn't have time to verify it, but I was pulling up, asking questions to AI and sort of pasting them into a central document. In my notes here, I've got that there was where is it here? The Israel was basically and at the same time the Paladin group was involved in the South Africa as well.
Yes.
And CIA and Israel providing arms. It's an overlap, just this constant overlap.
Yeah. Once again, haven't even got to Portugal. I mean, I don't know as much about Portugal, but I know that through the Agenta Press, I believe it's called, that was a Portuguese intelligence front group that was providing aid to people like Scorsese and cooperating with Spain, once again, towards a combination of anti-communism and to say anti-decolonization is sort of strange, but pro-Western, pro-imperialist, pro-colony kind of attitude. And one of the things that kind of made what you might call the Southern African anti-communist front viable, obviously the enablement that was provided by the Portuguese presence in Angola and Mozambique, which was a lifeline, not only a lifeline to Rhodesia and South Africa, but also provided a good amount of cover and aid for groups elsewhere, like the Paladin group, Otto Scorsese, and all these various groups. Although I'm not sure of the extent to which they were involved in Italy, for example, or things in the Eastern Mediterranean. But I'd be shocked if they weren't involved in Brazil.
And again, we see the overlap in South Africa with the idea of anti-communism. Today we would say that they were it wasn't really a communist movement. They were anti-apartheid movements, but of course they had strong communist influence. And today we see that South Africa is aligned in large part with China and Russia. So the justification shift, we get all the overlap you're talking about, and we get the same sort of ideological costume swaps.
Yes, but I mean the Paladin group in particular is quite an interesting. So in the Southern African context, I should have mentioned that there's also involvement with the war in the Congo as well. So I don't think it was the Paladin group in particular, because I don't think it had been formed by that point. But certain like predecessor movements, certain things that Otto Scorsese may have been put up to by Galen that were taking place in Katanga in particular, I believe. It's. I haven't even got into the full scope of what Galen was involved in, and that's kind of why I wanted to bring up him first. But there's almost, I think, just about every one of these conflicts that we've brought up has had some kind of connection to Galen in some way as well, even up to anti-France, as I briefly mentioned, and possibly involvement in assassination attempts against de Gaulle. Funnily enough, I think they were also privy to, they were essentially the connective tissue between America and Egypt as well during the Suez Crisis. It was, I believe, the Galen organization that first detected the full scope of what was going on in Egypt during the Suez Crisis, and alerted America, and kind of gave them the line of intelligence that sort of allowed them to correctly appraise the situation as it was playing out. So, yeah, another curious detail. But yes, guess it's relevant to mention where some of this ends up going. So, although there's kind of like a greater scope than what we've been able to cover here, I think it's probably sensible to try to bring it to some sort of conclusion as to sort of why
the bow on top moment.
Well, of sorts, yeah. So,
I mean, to whatever extent such a thing is possible.
Yeah. So what we kind of get is a changing of the guard more officially when you start to have the big players dropping. So, in particular, you have the death of Franco, of course, and the death of Scorsese, which are, I think, they happen a few months from one another, something like that. And Scorsese is one of the one of the pieces of connective tissue that keeps all this together. Galen has already retired by this point. A few years prior, I think it was in 1968, something like that. I think that he retires. Scorsese and Franco die in like 1975, I think. And they, at that point, because Spain had been like essentially the main base for all this during the fall of Franco's regime, and by extension the fall of the Carnation Revolution, there's no possibility of switching over to what's called Portugal either. I don't remember if in fact, funnily enough, I think I haven't brought up Greece that much, like I said, but I believe the Greek junta falls in 1974, I want to say, as well. Or at least they weren't. Yeah, I can't remember exactly when they fall, but it's around the same kind of time. And a lot of the figures who are kind of like able to keep all this together, because bearing in mind all this time talking about ex-SS personnel, and in some cases the original fascists, they're only going to live for so long, and there isn't a proper transfer. To some extent, there's a continuation of certain organizations, and the OAS in particular is able to. So, when we're talking about the OAS, we're talking about former OAS members, not the organization itself. But a lot of those people are able to, form some kind of continuation. We haven't even mentioned. No, I'll get to that later, actually. But yeah, it's like all these dominoes are pretty much coming down at the same kind of time, and although some of the governments that are set up with their involvement in South America do persist for a little bit longer, mostly they're kind of getting knocked over as well over time, and so yeah, it all just kind of disintegrates from there, and most of the connective tissue, the actual manpower that is keeping this together, sort of drains away. The organization drains away. The money that had been associated with it just doesn't seem to be there anymore. And yeah, it just sort of seems to disappear. But insofar as it does continue in any form, because a lot of the governments that are associated to disappear, some of the personnel get folded into certain domestic movements. So I've probably not mentioned him in proportion to his actual significance, but Jean-Jacques Susini, who was one of the founders of the OAS, later ended up being embroiled in the Italian Years of Lead. He actually ends up becoming a fairly prominent figure in French politics after there's a general amnesty for all people who were involved in the OAS, and basically anyone on the right who had opposed de Gaulle is given an amnesty. When de Gaulle has to deal with the French student riots, I think the amnesty is again in 1968, something like that. Or might be slightly later, but either way, a lot of people decide to just give up on the life of adventure at that point and just go back to France and actually try to settle down. But a lot of them do actually end up continuing to be involved in politics in one form or another, especially the far right. And Susini and indeed, actually, what's his name? Jean-Marie Le Pen. founder of the National Front. Essentially, they continue to hold the banner of this French side of the movement, and that becomes the sort of line of continuation, because Le Pen himself was actually a former paratrooper in, I think he was in Algeria, and I don't know if he was actually involved in the coup.
I'll check that right now.
It's good to know. I haven't checked that particular point, but he brings Susini along as well, and Susini actually ends up becoming a. I think he's elected. He was an elected representative of the French National Front, but he continues to be basically a mainstream figure in the French right.
He enlisted in the Foreign Legion. He was in French Indochina. Yes, I'm sorry. I'd have to dig here. I'm not seeing that he was actually in Algeria, but he did get himself involved politically, I think, to some extent with that. Sorry, it's not immediately clear.
Details. Yeah. He becomes like one of the main standard bearers. Well, obviously as the leader of the National Front at that point, but yeah, many of those figures end up going on to remain in politics in some fashion. And like I said, Susini becomes an influential figure in the National Front. This is interesting as a comparison against Britain, because although I haven't really mentioned them, they've been this sort of more of a. Britain's more peripheral, at least at the level of. Okay, no, that's perhaps not fair. So, Britain also seems to have a stay behind force, like I said, but we don't know much about it at present because there's not been any declassified documentation on it. But it is speculated that the Operation Clockwork Orange and various movements by internal MI5 police and government officials and people in the army and such were, at least to some degree. So they wanted to coup Harold Wilson, or at least made contingency plans for it, basically on the basis that they believed he was a communist agent. There were some warning shots fired, and that didn't really come to anything more than that. I believe that was in the 70s, 74, 75, I want to say, maybe 75, 76. It was heavily suggested that these people were involved with the stay behind formations as well, especially because I believe one of the figures who was supportive of this was David Sterling, that is the founder of the SAS. And considering the main role of Britain at this time in the wider underground networks was as a base of training, which the SAS were involved in, it is supposed, it stands to reason that, yes, people like David Sterling were major players in what would have been in the stay behind force as an equivalent to Operation Gladio. But we don't. I don't think we even have a name for what the British counterpart would have been. But funnily enough, lending perhaps some credence to the idea that that this was that certain elements of the British side, at least, were fairly top down. The far-right elements that were involved in this international network from the British side were mainly revolved around training and a network of safe houses rather than providing direct manpower for anything in particular, I believe. So, in particular, there was a group that was associated with Delachaye and the anti-communist international groups that was known as Column 88. Anyone listening, I probably don't need to explain what the 88 actually means, but yeah, their main role was essentially as providing safe houses for neo-fascists who were involved in the various bombings. That was revealed by an infiltrator, I believe, who leaked it to the media, I want to say. Predecessors to groups like Hope Not Hate, a guy who, I can't remember his name now, might have been Harold something, who flipped communist at some point during international placement or some kind of like international visit of sorts as part of the right. And that's why we know anything about that organization. But in all likelihood, there are others that we just never really got too much detail on. But it's interesting as a comparison to the French example, because one thing that happens with the British right wing is a complete disavowal of whatever movement came prior. So I don't think there was any interest by the groups like Column 88 to work with predecessors such as the Imperial Fascist League or the British Union Fascists or the British Fascisti or the like all these various interwar organizations that basically died either during or shortly after the war.
The only thing that I saw that might bear on that, I think I mentioned it at the outset of the stream when I was looking at the idea of pan-European nationalism, which is, distinct from just further EU integration or whatever. It's sort of the idea of Europe as a super state organized, I guess, more centrally on racial lines and less on based on the idea of the distinct cultures maintaining themselves quite as well. I'm not entirely clear on it, so don't take this as a gospel. I've warned everyone at the outset that this is not my bailiwick, but it seems that I think it was in the late 40s, perhaps early 50s, that oh, good heavens! Now I'm having a Mosley. Mosley was a proponent of pan-European nationalism, but he seemed to think that the U.S. should be the center of gravity for it, or its primary ally, a means to making it happen. Whereas Yaki, who was originally working with Mosley in furtherance of ideas or projects like this, eventually split from him and called Mosley a tool of the United States. And Yaki, from what I understand of it, then set out to he saw basically Russia as the lesser of two evils in terms of the best prospect for realizing that project. Now I don't know, for example, much about Mosley, and I certainly can't say that he was doing what he was doing on behalf of factions within Britain, but it seems difficult to imagine that he wouldn't have been. But again, I don't know much about him. It just seems very likely that he would have been, at least if we take the willingness of the victorious powers after World War II to work with former fascists as any kind of guide regarding what's possible. I don't know what you make of that. It just seemed worth throwing that out there.
Yeah, I mean, especially after everything we've talked about, it definitely fits into a mold. So, a mold of people who we know are linked to the US in some way, even if they're not necessarily being controlled by the US. It's hard to make that judgment from the outside. But yeah, I don't have any particular information as to whether or not Mosley had special ties to the US on that basis. But even if he did, I've not really made as much of it as I've kind of noted in some of my reading, but there does seem to kind of be a tension at certain points between British intelligence and American affiliated intelligence, whether that be through the Galen organization or whether that be the CIA. And they definitely are organizing and cooperating in that sense, but there also does seem to be at times a definite tension.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that I'm not suggesting that Yaki would necessarily, in saying that that Mosley was a tool of America, I'm not asserting that Mosley was. I'm suggesting the possibility that he might have been furthering the interest of, let's say, a North Atlantic power bloc that I would not position precisely in New York or in London, but sort of distributed as we see today with this sort of neocon movement and their current projects. But anyway, that's a bit of a digression probably as well. I know you were trying to put a bow on it. I apologize.
Well, I mean, equally, he might have just been taking the lay of the land and coming to the same conclusion as Scorsese, even if where, I think there's a valid narrative that says Scorsese, as a fairly independent player, came to the conclusion that the Soviets were still the greater evil, and there is a kind of element of World War II German strategic desire to be the hard edge of a united West against communism. And indeed, that was kind of one of the, funnily enough, if you're familiar with Operation Unthinkable, there's curious.
I'm not actually. Can you summarize it very quickly?
Okay. Operation Unthinkable was a proposal by Churchill, or a plan by Churchill, to basically continue World War II after the capitulation of the Germans by continuing to march east by through the arming of the now capitulated German army as a as a Western controlled force, to basically just rearm the exact same army that they just defeated, and then use it, weaponize it against the Soviets in combination with Allied forces. But funnily enough, in the later stages of the war, that was actually a hope by the Germans. So a lot of the German soldiery, and particularly in the officer cadres, they were sort of hoping for some kind of outcome like that. As perverse as it may sound, to be, willingly offering themselves up to be the meat that is going to be armed by the Western powers. But that does seem to have been considered an ideal outcome by many of them. So it's sort of fairly easy to imagine that in that sort of psychological state, many of the committed fighters would willingly offer themselves up, basically, for the purpose of continuing to fight communism, even though their original ideological grounding for that is gone, and they just fully embrace the Cold Warrior mindset.
Well, we see there the continuing sort of, it's an interesting sort of dialectical question, this flip-flopping one side of the coin, I should say, rather, one side of the coin has fascism or neo-fascism on it, depending on the period we're talking about, whether it's, the original movement and the people who are a part of it, as we're discussing here, or the ones who came later. You have the idea of fascism or neo-fascism on one side of the coin, and then on the other you have the communism and the anti-communism. And indeed, it's difficult to and I guess I should be specific here, German National Socialism and fascism, of course, but it's difficult to think of a situation where fascism wouldn't, or National Socialism of the mid-century German variety, where it wouldn't also always already be anti-communism. But it's interesting how the shift in emphasis allows this thing to keep going. So if you're a National Socialist who sees the whole project go down in flames, as it were, or literally, certainly in Dresden, you could see how well you can continue to have the same motivation and keep the project alive by making it, more strictly anti-communist.
Yeah, I mean, it's also potentially a lowest common denominator kind of thing as well, where you can get a lot of different elements on board.
Yeah, different countries, and then we come back to the international right, the whole idea of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I mentioned a certain amount of there's a little bit of a question mark over someone like a Dulles, if only because he had sort of pre-war connections to it's a very leftist point, but it's kind of interesting in light of other things that I've read about, that supposedly he may have been somewhat compromised, even if only either financially or ideologically, by the fact that I think primarily before the war, during the early stages of the war, and maybe even after the war, he had, or his family had business connections to IG Farben, possibly some other, National Socialist affiliated corporations, but IG Farben is the big one, and that's been used to, suppose. I mean, I guess you could get into other things like the business plot as well, and how much ideological content that potentially is behind that, and whether someone like a Dulles would be involved in something like that. But there is also the possibility that, taking the example of someone like Dulles, there was actually a genuine faction within the CIA that did actually have ideological commitments which went a little bit beyond anti-communism, but broad stroke anti-communism was the public face for it, and the most acceptable way of expressing it,
and mobilizing disparate groups in furtherance of it. Yeah, as we were just talking about. So did you perhaps I'm jumping too far ahead, but have you formed a sense of the primary players or those who, if anyone does, still carry the torch today? I mean, one obvious way to look at it is, of course, major commercial and industrial concerns that are threatened by the disappearance of what passes as private property. So with the Himmler's circle of friends, we certainly see that. I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think I'm remembering correctly that Rockefeller was somehow involved in providing the formula for high octane gasoline to the Germans. I can't remember if that's right. But obviously major industrialists, captains of industry, these sorts of people would have the most to lose from the spread of communism, and so they very likely would sort of form an ideological position dialectically in contrast to communism. So it would seem to make sense that those people behind it, major bankers or industrialists in the West, would be behind, via the various governments that they influence, would be behind these efforts. But that's just me trying to pluck a needle from this haystack of possibilities.
Yeah, in terms of like rational incentives, you would sort of think there would be something like that there as a remnant, but it does sort of seem, from the outside at least, that either the business interests and conglomerates and whatever have made their peace with communism such as it exists, or the dispossession of their autonomy as a business, or whatever component of control they have over that. But it does just seem like the actual ideological impetus has just sort of left. I don't know if communism, you could say, has sort of like lost its allure in the same way, but anti-communism as an animating force does seem to have sort of died. That's partly why I've been at pains to sort of get to personnel in particular and the individuals that were involved, because it does seem like a kind of generational thing where we kind of got like one or two generations of kind of like hardcore international right anti-communist proper Cold Warriors, and since they're gone, there's not quite the same there. I mean, I know the Reagan era and onwards did have its own sort of flavor of anti-communist fervor, but it seems to be coming from a slightly different generational perspective, and possibly even with a slightly different ideological content. By that point, it seems like, insofar as there is a conflict between the, I don't know if communism, you could say, has sort of like lost its allure in the same way, but I think the actual ideological impetus has left. The actual ideological impetus has just sort of left. The as I kind of framed it before, but didn't necessarily make as explicit as I perhaps should, a conflict between the CIA and the State Department in particular, which is a reoccurring feature. So the State Department will be more so the progressive, democracy-loving, kind of purse string NGO type side of American influence, and then the CIA, especially under certain figures, is the more cloak and dagger, supporting paramilitaries. Still have NGOs and front companies and all kind of stuff, and they still did certain cultural things, but a lot more willing to use the hard edge of anti-communism. But there's a slightly different ideological content seemingly between those two groups, and they often work at direct cross purposes to one another.
But then at the same time, you've got the sort of fundamental underlying map realities, which is to say, as I'm sure you understand, but for listeners who might not, there are hard geopolitical realities which correspond to the geo in geopolitical. The Straits of Hormuz will always be important, maybe more, maybe less, but they'll always be important. Likewise, the Bosphorus, or the Straits of Malacca, or the Cape of Good Hope. And so, as I was trying to illustrate with the subject of Imperial Russia and British grand strategy related to Imperial Russia, or, NATO and the United States attempting to deal with the USSR, or today, with the same sort of bookending. Now it's still Japan, but now we've got South Korea as well at one end, and at the other end we've got the Baltic states and Poland and Hungary, and we're trying to flip Azerbaijan. Perhaps we already have, trying to flip Armenia, Georgia, these kinds of things. Well, those realities persist beneath the surface, and what we've seen, or at least what I think I've seen in the course of this very helpful discussion, is these ideological costume swaps. Like I was talking about neo-fascist, and then the emphasis is placed instead on anti-communist. But you touched on something again that I found really striking earlier in the discussion, and it might help us carry this up into the present day. And that is this odd shift. You have the Ba'athist parties, which are Arab nationalist, national socialist, to a certain extent, across the Middle East, as I've said, I think ultimately modeled on Ataturk's successful efforts. But like Nasser, or Hussein, or the father and son in Syria, they're all gone now, and in being toppled, that the alignment of the Arabs with sort of national socialist ideas that are not explicitly religious at all, that might be in tension with Islam. You certainly saw it with Ataturk. Well, those national socialist, secular, military guaranteed regimes have fallen across the Middle East, and what we have instead are what are more traditional monarchies, and what gets called Islamist, which is just a polite way not to have to say Muslim. But we can leave that aside for the moment. I found that very interesting, as I pointed out when you were talking earlier. It's like these people would not be the natural allies of communists. Now, of course, there have always been many true believers from the Middle East who are leftists and communists, but they now seem to be in ascendancy as an alternative to masked or disguised colonialism, or the traditional top-down exploitative monarchies that you could arguably see in Dubai or Qatar or Saudi Arabia. And so we see this interesting thing now where communism of the atheistic variety and Middle Easterners, under the whole thing of intersectional alignments, this has now come to the fore. And so now what we've seen is, instead of like neo-fascist, anti-communist being two sides of one of the opposing poles, if I'm sort of mixing my metaphors here because you're ending up with a quaternity, but and on the other side you have the the communists and the anti-colonialists. Well, now you've got this sort of post-Muslim anti-colonialist communism, which we can see expressed, I think, certainly in the figure of Mamdani in New York, and we have sort of the enemy, so to speak, in Europe being, hordes of non-Europeans who go with this sort of intersectionality and this opportunism. But you've got an alliance there with what would be called Islamist forces. And that's very, very interesting to me, because it sort of comes back to this theme of an ideological costume swap. And correspondingly, you see the right-wing movements, such as they are, and they might, in fact, likely are, in fact, to whatever extent they're actually right-wing, as I was talking about earlier in the discussion, much earlier in the discussion, they're aligning against the mass immigration and the sort of intersectionality and that alignment of those things with Islamism to some extent. So now the right wing isn't fascist; it's partially anti-communist, maybe. Although it's arguable that you could call like a right-wing figure, like a so-called right-wing figure like Marine Le Pen, really anti-communist. She seems to be, very, very leftist, as the majority of the European politicians, whether glossed as left or right, actually are. I'm sorry, I'm not saying this very, very clearly, but we've seen these ideological costume swaps, as I've called them, that are used to dress up the fundamental geostrategic realities and the latest phase of the great game. But I think there's been a cunning switch here where somehow the Muslim world has taken a front and center role in the concerns of Europe in ways that we did not see in the past, simply because those populations hadn't flooded the West. And it's weird how this relates to Algeria, how North Africa is one of these major players. I believe there was just a vote in France having to do with potentially removing some of the privileges enjoyed by Algerians in France. Again, this isn't coming out very well, but I sense some sort of shift in the picture, and I don't know how spontaneous or organic it was. Perhaps it's the result of it being in the interest of certain groups to frame things in this way. But now Islam and immigration are very much a part of the picture. And the right wing has been positioned dialectically to be a response to that. Again, that didn't come out very well, but I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I think it came up earlier, that the actual definition of what is constituting the right that we've been talking about is mostly just cold warrior, pro-West, but the battleground has shifted, and so some of these people get left behind, and anyone who's trying to be a cold warrior in the modern day is kind of seeming a little bit anachronistic by comparison, but by comparison to the actual contemporary issues of the day. The way that it translates, as we've sort of touched on, is often just a bizarre Russophobia, rather, which makes no sense. And to be fair, the communists have the same kind of thing, where you have communists like practically card carrying Stalinists from, like, I don't know, Canada or America, who are fighting in the Donbass alongside avowed Russian neo-Nazis. And they both consider themselves to be on the same side, and it's bizarre in isolation, and it's possibly an expression of the fact that we, for a long time, have been in this kind of in-between stage where there has been I guess you could argue that there was an ill-defined divide for a long time. Maybe the start of the long 21st century, you could say, or something, with the fall of communism, and nobody on the right and left really properly knew what to do with themselves. So we got the neo ideologies that didn't actually have significant ideological content enough to make for proper divides. I mean, insofar as pure ideological content and academic concerns were involved, there was still a right and there was still a left. But in terms of how that manifested in international organizations, such as the one we've been talking about, you were not going to be able to organize, like an international militia or an international battle lines that would be drawn along the issues of, like, the kind of issues that the neolibs and neoconservatives would be talking about. So finally, maybe we are going to be approaching a stage where there is a recognizable left and there is a recognizable right, and they can operate internationally. And I don't want to get too far into it, but there's a whole rabbit hole to go down with regards to what the comparison to that might be and where the actual dividing lines fall down. Maybe that would be a topic for a future discussion, because very, very much concerns Russia and a lot of international happenings since the 90s.
Yeah, and I've certainly kept you here for quite some time without so much as a break. Well, I will. Two things. I'd be very, very happy to continue the discussion, however and whenever it suits you. But I feel like I should ask at the end if you were able to bring up all the things that you wanted to. Is there anything that that you want to cover here that you haven't had an opportunity to do?
There are other bits, and I don't know if there's enough for a second stream on the subject to fill in all the gaps, because I know there's just so much that I haven't been able to cover that would figure in connective tissue. So I guess I could just try and gallop through a few relevant points.
Absolutely. Once more into the breach, sir.
So for one thing, Greece, I mentioned. They're relevant. You're bringing up the geographic angle, and the main issue there with Greece. World War II ends, and by far the most well-organized groups are the communists, who had been, acting as resistance agents on the ground. But initially, primarily Britain sees the problem that a communist Greece is going to yield, especially in the form of giving the USSR effectively ports in the Eastern Mediterranean, which they really do not want, which Britain really does not want to happen. So the units that they have on side, they're basically hosting the Greek government in exile, and the Greek military in exile, for that matter, who is positioned in North Africa. So they essentially organize a purge of the military down to its most hardcore royalist and hardcore anti-communist elements, because prior to that there had been certain centrist liberal types in the military who were a little bit more amenable to a moderate compromise. So it's slightly an open question whether it was organic or whether it was organized by British intelligence, but either one way or another, the military is there. The military there is purged, and they have a rump of the military which is 100% loyal, 100% anti-communist. They go back into, so after the liberation of Greece in 1944, I believe, they establish themselves, they re-establish the government. They don't go back with the king immediately, so as to not inflame things when the communists are essentially still running the show on the ground. But they are presented with the opportunity of a number of Greek resistance formations which had come around to the idea. So because they were quite anti-communist themselves, they'd come around to the idea that Germany was the lesser evil, despite occupying the country and everything. So they were organized into what was called security battalions, I believe. And the security battalions are quietly folded into the Greek police and the Greek military. Effectively, they're treated, and probably were for all intents and purposes, either remnant fascist elements from the August 4th regime of Metaxas, or they were National Socialist sympathizers, or just enough of a anti-communist to enough of an extent that they could be considered fascists, and they were essentially fitting in quite well alongside the elements of the military that were also pro-Metaxas, because obviously remember at the outset of the invasion, Metaxas was the government, and effectively Greece had a fascist government. So those elements get brought in. There is a civil war later. The communists lose, so they are very much marginalized, and the Greek security battalion elements / fascists / the right wing rump is able to maintain basically complete dominance over the military. After that, the British influence that had been maintained up until that point was essentially usurped by America, in particular through Marshall Plan aid, which is a component of everything that I've not really brought up to enough of an extent. But Marshall Plan aid was often diverted for all of these groups to the stay behind networks, providing a revenue stream to those. So Operation Gladio, for example, would have been receiving Marshall Plan aid, but in Greece we have one of the clearer examples of it being used for basically overtly political aims, because they refuse to fund Greece to the tune of the Marshall Plan aid, which Greece at this point is heavily reliant on, if the Greek politicians are not basically playing to their tune. Which the way that translates is a new party is created somewhere down the line that effectively becomes the avatar of this, which is called Greek Rally. It's kind of like a centre-right sort of thing, founded by a general, Papagos, I believe, one of the victorious generals of the Civil War. But he's a more moderate figure amongst elements of the right, because a lot of the security battalions that were brought into the army and the police, in particular in the army, they form a secret society called IDEA. I can't remember what it stands for. It's an acronym. It's an acronym for something. And it starts out as a group for mutual assistance, basically to protect each other's backs, knowing that at any time they could be, rooted out as former collaborators. But it eventually grows into something with a lot greater ideological, solidness to it, basically. A much stronger ideological foundation, and potentially even some amount of greater fanaticism over time. Only open to officers, and it's a very closed system, not including too many men. But so when the Greek rally is essentially beaten at last by a renewed liberal opposition, they begin to dismantle some of the things that America has kind of patronized into existence, and start sort of diverting a little bit more towards a softer line on the communists, who were also starting to come into their own somewhat. And whether they were put up to it, or whether it was something that was more organic in formation, one way or another, the IDEA secret society basically springs into action as a coup force, and they launch a coup against the government in I can't remember the year. I can't remember the year, and can't check right now. But yeah, if you could have a quick look for me, that would be handy. And yeah, they form a junta government, which basically becomes I don't think it's necessarily and this is one of the cases probably where you can make a stronger case that that at the very least a somewhat rogue faction of the CIA was running the show on the Greek issue, because they don't receive quite the warm response that they expected, and America is tolerant but somewhat more frosty than they had been, I believe. Potentially because the Greeks are basically going too far against the State Department line. So the State Department is having to rein in the machinations of the CIA. Would be again one explanation, but another would be that it is simply this internal IDEA organization, secret society organization within the officers that basically just forms the junta on their own accord and misjudges
I
situation.
I just got IDEA, and it's apparently holy bond of Greek officers. What was there a second question I missed that I was supposed to check for you?
The date, well, the year at least of the coup. I think it's the colonel's coup, I want to say, but the first officer's coup in Greece. I think it's 67, but I don't remember specifically.
There was an unsuccessful military coup attempt apparently by these guys in 1951. Would that be the right one?
No, it's the successful
one. Let me see here. You go on, and I'll try to find it rather than keep you waiting. Let me see here.
But anyway, yes. So this is another vital node in this whole arrangement is that the Greeks, I believe, were providing some amount of manpower, like volunteer manpower, to the international movements, and also providing a training ground and a base of operations to some degree for some of these figures as well. Out in the Eastern Mediterranean.
I think that's 1967.
Yes. Okay, I thought so. So yeah, that's Greece. Yeah, I think that's the main point. I guess the only other thing to mention would be just again the absolute lack of proper continuity from a lot of this stuff. Taiwan exists as a government in the same, not quite the same form, but they're theoretically one of the governments that's still persisting, but in a drastically different form by this point, to kind of see how far things can fall. I didn't mention them up to this point, but the Kuomintang in the Golden Triangle I did, but they were a major player as well in the Asian context of the anti-communists behind South Korea, of course. South Korea is one of the countries that still persists. Paraguay, funnily enough, is a country that has maintained somewhat more of its identity from this time period. But I don't know as much about that, going out of the time period that I'm focused on. Lebanon, obviously not. It's just a wreck. All of the European countries have, many of them still have personnel to some extent that can draw some kind of lineage. So I mentioned the National Front, which, as you mentioned, is what are they called now? Rassemblement National, or was it National Rally? Or either way, the successors to the National Front.
Yes, Rassemblement National, which means national rally in the sense of rallying together to answer the issues. Yeah.
Yes. So they would be a successor of sorts. The Brothers of Italy, I guess you could argue, is a kind of extremely, by this point, watered down.
A development of a splinter from some of the MSI groups.
Yeah. Funny enough, I suppose Bolsonaro. We didn't really talk about Brazil much, but Bolsonaro, I guess you could argue, is a successor to some of this kind of stuff, because he was he rose to prominence on the basis of basically supporting the military government up until I think it fell in 1985, I want to say.
Yeah, my knowledge of Brazil is lamentable. I'm sorry, my lack of knowledge is lamentable. Yeah.
Yes, but anyway, so I guess you could consider him some kind of successor, debatably. But it gets us to the one country other than maybe South Korea that actually maintains this whole movement in its possibly purest form is Israel, of all places, which was as we discussed, kind of a latecomer in this grouping. But they seem to have, as far as I can tell, insofar as it is actually a culture that is inculcated into the military, they seem to have internalized the French counterinsurgency school, and I would encourage people to go look into that because, it has a lot of implications, a lot of historical implications for not only how Israel conducts itself and how France used to conduct itself, but also it was quite significant in the Vietnamese context, as I think I briefly mentioned as well. Quite influential. Again, if we're talking about there being a particular school in the CIA, the sorts of people who are open to those kinds of methods, and you can connect certain dots in your own time, I'm sure, on how it relates to certain activities of the CIA that are cloaked in an air of total amorality, I guess you might say. Some of the things that the leftist side of the conspiracy theory sphere like to point at and highlight. But yes. So alongside that, you also have obviously so they're extremely militarized, and although the communist versus anti-communist issue is not a live one anymore, the original battle lines that existed sort of still continued. I mean, we've discussed that that's probably more so due to the fact that the battle lines were more contrived in the first place. So it wasn't really about communism in the first place. It was more just about the ethnic and religious component that now the pretense has been dropped, as it were.
And the territorial components, the sort of raw power calculations of containing Russia, for example.
Yeah, but you can see it in the the lost alliances, as it were, as well, because obviously we've not really discussed South Africa too much in this context, but it was a fairly major player. Most the ways in which they were contributing manpower to this kind of thing it's a kind of a different organization, really. At that point, it's not. So I don't think they were contributing all that much manpower online. Neither South Africa nor Rhodesia were really contributing much manpower to things like the Paladin Group. But the Paladin Group was providing services to South Africa and Rhodesia. So the relationship was more so that way around. But yeah, I mean, South Africa would be another one that maintained something of this kind of movement for the longest time, but disappeared relatively late in the game. Again, I guess you can tie that up. I know I'm not the first person to point this out, but the fall of South Africa to coincide with the fall of the Eastern Bloc is perhaps indicative of this kind of trend, is because the thing that was propping it up as an ally more so was the presence of communism and that web of alliances and antagonisms that just didn't necessarily make sense anymore. So the State Department got its way finally.
Yes, in terms of those competing blocks. But if indeed Israel, arguably a relative latecomer to this, certainly involved in quite a bit of it in one way and another, if they still maintain certain capabilities and predispositions, as well as institutional knowledge dating from this period, and they've got funding and wherewithal, then perhaps that would explain to some extent the thing that I was trying to talk about earlier that I couldn't get out properly, which is this whole aspect of Islam moving into the mix. The so-called right-wing parties of Europe are focused on things, at least rhetorically, like immigration and Europe being overwhelmed with opportunistic migration, to put it as charitably as possible. If they are the inheritors of some of the surviving aspects of the networks, to whatever extent they could be said to survive, then perhaps it would make sense that the dialectic of what used to be fascism or anti-communism versus communism, now it has become anti-immigration and putatively nationalist movements aligned against a combination of, which doesn't seem at all intuitive, of quote unquote Islamism and sort of intersectional post-Marxist global liberalism. I still can't quite sort it out, but perhaps what you mentioned there about Israel would help to explain why Islam is a part of this picture now.
What immediately comes to mind actually is in certain online spheres, the counter-jihad movement is sort of treated as a form of containment, and maybe that would be what is being identified here, or what we're talking about is the idea of trying to reduce everything to this. So that's the new anti-communism, as it were, is trying to turn Islam versus non-Islam as set that as the new dividing line, more or less. And that works from the perspective of, I'm sure you've come across the Indian Israelophilia.
Yes, and a considerable overlap that I'm sure involves cutouts, plausible deniability, and cooperation on all sorts of levels.
Well, in that case, there may be some top-down element, but what comes to mind for me is that it just becomes an immediate proxy for India's own concerns with Pakistan, which is the far more enduring,
and its own
conflict.
And its own Muslim population within India,
of course,
in addition to Pakistan. But what it also allows you to do, if you frame it as being something along the lines of something like nativist nationalist versus Islamist and globalist, then, well, first of all, it seems to perfectly suit the interests of a country like Israel, and it would go a long way towards accounting for the fact that we see the predispositions and alignments that we do, from Tommy Robinson to Eric Zemmour to Geert Wilders, certainly, though apparently his fortunes have changed. It seems as though we've got a new dialectical framing. And what's interesting about it is that the communists, the people who used to be glossed as communists, whether you want to talk about the slow method sort of Fabian society thing, or Soros's open society or whatever, it's no longer necessary for it to be anti-communist. If you can have, India is full, absolutely packed to the gills with communists. And even the Hindutva movement, I'm sure, has heavy elements of socialism. And so what you see here is a new kind of, basically they're not, if the Islamists are the quote unquote Islamists are the enemy, then you can counterpose what are essentially global liberal policies against Islamism and have this sort of shadow war going on with categories that ultimately are not beneficial to the populations that embrace them. I'm not sure that came out right, but what I'm saying is it allows communism in, or the new thing that used to be communism, because it's not truly communism anymore. And you can counterpose it against the hordes of replacement population, and occupy everyone's attention with that, while all the countries are fundamentally changed. And in the end, the population substitution continues apace. So in some respect, it's the continuation of the techniques and predispositions and skills that were applied in this international right fight against communism, but those categories have been emptied. And in the end, it's, I guess, something along the lines of heads I win, tails you lose.
Yeah, I mean, we mainly focused on, again, the hardest edge of these kinds of movements, and the people who are at the bleeding edge of all the activities, whether that be organic or centrally controlled. Is, again, I leave it to be an open question. I tend to believe that there's at least a very good amount of decentralization there, but that's a separate conversation. But the people who ultimately won really were the State Department. Really, the State Department view, in the sense of the people who weren't even necessarily taking part in the direct fights, but were just molding things in the background. So, although certain people might have been fighting for something more specific, what everyone got in the end is some form of social democracy, basically.
Yes, and it speaks to the apparent effectiveness of a Fabian strategy. I'm not saying the Fabian society is behind it, mind you. I think the primary player would be the State Department and the sort of figures behind that. The ones that we talk about as Soros, but I'm sure there are many others that are have chosen not to surface themselves and make their activities obvious. And I don't, I mean, as I said at the outset of the stream, I know very little, excuse me, about this subject. And so all of this is absolutely raw speculation on my part. And I'm certainly not attributing my groping here for some sort of way to frame it all as being the opinion of our excellent guest, Rupert August. I'm not sure that I've come away from this with any more certainty as regards what was going on, but I've enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, I mean, portraying it all as dropped spaghetti is an analogy that I like to stick to, because there's just so many links, and everything links together. Different people were all over the place doing, getting involved in completely separate events. And one thing I just found is that so many of these things are either treated as a monolith, with the US being behind everything. So you just say, oh yeah, the anti-communist movements in South America, it's all just the US. Well, there's a little bit more to it than that. Or conversely, that you just talk about each country individually and you don't really look at what's going on behind the curtain. So if you're reading a book on French politics, or the OAS in particular, then you don't necessarily get as much of a sense of what was going on among the members outside of that very specific context. But it's all interconnected, and these people were just getting around all over the place, and sometimes there's connections you don't necessarily expect. I don't think that I have a particular through line perspective on all of it either. I don't perceive a single narrative to attach onto, much like yourself. It's mostly just an exploration of data and connecting all these different things up to I don't know, maybe someone else to come up with some kind of cohesive thesis.
Yes, the only thing I think that stands out very clearly, which is useful as what they like to call a takeaway from all of this, perhaps, and that is when you're talking about a communist international, the old classic Comintern, the Trotskyist ideas behind it, you're not really talking about a nation. Certainly, someone like Stalin would come in later and say, no, we're going to anchor this in nations of some description. But the fundamental idea is transnational, in the sense that it goes above and beyond it. It operates outside of the scope of nations themselves. And I think what's interesting about looking at the Cold War sort of quote unquote right wing international is that, again, we see something that's quite international. And so perhaps the takeaway regarding all of this is that those of us who want to make sense of anything should perhaps be very cautious in discussing what nations do and how nations are responsible for this or that. My whole thing I get into often with Britain, quote unquote, being responsible for things. It's misunderstood, and for understandable reasons, because I'm not really talking about Britain. I don't want to get heavily into this, but it's easy for me to say that there were North Atlantic powers that were formerly based in Britain that are still based in the city of London, but they're also based in New York and DC, and in large part in Brussels, apparently. And you can make sense of something like the Suez Crisis from that perspective, because you have a group of people who still think in national terms, or at least imperial terms, anchored in the interests of a given nation. And they come up against and perhaps get blindsided by groups that are operating transnationally. And so I think that, as I said, a takeaway regarding all of this might be that thinking in terms of nations, and even to a certain extent in terms of supranational bodies like the European Union, that it may conceal more than it reveals if you use it as a hermeneutic, if you will. So, international left, international right, well, what's the common denominator? It's international. And I think what we've seen is, any specific individual given country or group of countries, it just becomes a way to, move the shells around, and so that you don't see which one has the P underneath. And the transnational, supranational aspect of this is something that we probably need a better vocabulary to tackle, to consider, to talk about, and to understand. That by way of some attempt at a profound summary statement. I realize it falls flat, but that's all that really occurs to me. Is there anything before we wrap up that strikes you?
Yeah, I would emphasize that point. I really, I can't agree more. I would perhaps add that looking at factions and interests even within groups that we might often treat cohesively is useful as well. So instead of talking about the US government, for example, trying to break it down into entities that might be working at cross purposes. So I've even in this, I've perhaps committed something of a faux pas in talking about the CIA as a cohesive entity, which I can firmly believe is not always the case as well, where you have entities which are operating, much more rogue than others. But it's unless you're on the inside or have hard documented proof, it's kind of hard to often make concrete judgments unless you see one element working directly against another in open conflict, which you don't necessarily see all that often. But thinking in terms of these, nodes that have connections in lateral and perhaps unexpected ways is, I think, extremely important, because talking about the right-wing movement in one country that might be actually recruiting personnel from another and might be receiving funding from a third, or any number of these connections which exist laterally, is both it's important to know from both sides of that equation, especially for what is going to be the makings of a successful organization. Otherwise, well, you don't really necessarily know what you're emulating.
Yeah. Yes, and you don't know what the ultimate aims, assuming anything approaching singular ones can be ascribed to such organizations. You don't know what the aims of them actually were. It's revealed in the fullness of time, or as they like to say, by their fruits you will know them. And I certainly have seen little to convince me that the aims of all the aim, if you will, of all of this effort that you reviewed, in this Cold War context, was really to buttress and support nations, because we've seen quite the contrary. But again, it's something we can only hypothesize about. I've kept you for quite some time, sir. I thank you very much, very, very much for sharing this with me, for proposing the stream. Before we take off, I do want to point again to the description box below this video over here on YouTube. For people who are watching on or listening to this over on X, you can, if you like, just click the link from the original post about this. It will take you to the description box over on YouTube, where you will see links for Rupert August's YouTube channel, as well as for his X. And for anybody who might be too lazy to do that, Rupert, is your just at Rupert August?
But of course, yes. I might, I've been forever trying to get back to posting more regularly, because I've kind of fallen off a little bit. But I used to do big threads that talked about similar topics that we've discussed today, and hopefully I'll get back to it.
Yeah, I hope so too. I'm sure many of the listeners will agree. I appreciate all of the work and your charity and walking me through this. It's been something of an education. So thank you, sir. And you're always very, very, very welcome here. For all the listeners, for the channel supporters, thank you very much. Feel free to buy my books, indicated down in the description box below. You can buy me a coffee if you like. I see that Donnie Browning, one of our newly minted moderators, has posted a link to Rupert August's YouTube channel. Again, you can find him at Rupert August over on X. And if anyone wants to buy me a coffee, you can do that at buymeacoffee.com/semiagog. It will be greatly appreciated. I have to buy diapers. Yes, ladies and gents, thanks very much for being here. Thanks again to Rupert August. And until next time.
May I quickly plug one other thing, actually? I'm also involved with the Pentagon Foundation. So if you go over and have a look at either at their X page or their YouTube page, I've actually released a video fairly recently for the Pentagon YouTube channel. We are trying to look at restoring castles, so trying to get something done in the real world.
Yeah, that's a very interesting project. Did I see you did a piece with Nathan Hood, who is central to those efforts? It was on the idea of the castle, the fortress itself.
Yes, indeed. So I've made a video talking about the strategic utilization of castles, basically, and how they fit into a grand strategy, and the military applications and such.
Yeah, I think that's the whole Pendragon project is something very, very interesting to me. I've been watching it from a distance. I encourage everyone to have a look at that. Actually, before we go, let me just go ahead and see if I can pull up Nathan Hood's, and he should have a link. He should have a link to Pendragon here. Yeah, there we go. For those who are interested, you can find out more about the Pendragon efforts here. It's at Pendragon.org over on X. Please, ladies and gentlemen, check that out and consider lending your help and support however you might be able to. Anything else, sir?
That's it. Thank you. I've already got some ideas as to what I may be back to talk about. So hopefully it won't be too long until I can join you again.
Excellent, sir. Thank you very much. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Thank you all very much. I am Semiagog, and I am out.